Hello there, you're listening to The Planet's Memory, where time breathes and the Earth remembers. What if ancient stars once whispered instructions into dust, and Earth learned them before it learned life? Wherever this night finds its way to you, under a quiet ceiling, beside a dim window, or drifting between thoughts, I'm glad you're here. This is not a story that rushes. It does not explain itself. It settles. Long before breath, before memory learned how to keep names, the planet listened. Not with ears, with gravity, with heat, with patience older than language. Tonight, the telling moves slowly, like ash falling through dark water, toward a question that never asks to be answered, only remembered. Before the planet learned how to hold a surface, before it learned the habit of turning, there was brightness without witness. Not light as warmth, but as pressure, as insistence. Stars burned, not to be seen, but because balance demanded it. Hydrogen folded into helium. Helium leaned into heavier names. Inside those furnaces, time did not pass. It tightened. Fusion was not creation. It was containment. A long refusal to fall apart. For millions of years, stars held themselves together through constant surrender. Mass becoming energy, energy becoming heat, heat becoming structure. Nothing rested, nothing slept. Even stillness was busy. And yet this could not last. Every star carries a quiet exhaustion buried beneath its shine, a point where holding becomes heavier than letting go. When that moment arrives, there is no drama in the universe, only release. Gravity wins not by force, but by patience. The core tightens, layers fold inward, light collapses back into itself. Then, ash. Not the soft ash of fire, but the kind that remembers pressure. Carbon arrives first, shaped by tension rather than intention. Oxygen follows not as breath, but as residue. Iron settles in the aftermath, dense with the memory of collapse. Gold appears briefly, violently, formed in. Moments so extreme they leave no room for hesitation. These elements are not born gently, they are shaken loose. When a star forgets how to stay whole, it scatters its interior across darkness. Supernovae are not explosions in the way minds imagine them, they are unbindings. The star opens, and what was once held privately becomes public to the void. There is no direction, no destination, only dispersal. The universe accepts this debris without comment. Dust spreads thin, then thinner still, crossing distances too large for meaning. Each particle carries within it a history of heat no future planet will ever fully decode. Memory is not stored as story. It exists as tendency, as preference, as weight. Carbon drifts with a particular patience, shaped by its ability to bind and unbind without breaking itself. Iron moves differently, heavy, decisive, drawn towards centers it has not yet found. Oxygen lingers, reactive, restless, unwilling to remain alone. These are not personalities, they are habits learned under extreme conditions. Time here does not feel like time. It stretches until sequence loses relevance. Millions of years pass without witness. Then, millions more. Dust does not age, it only travels. Silence fills the space between particles, not as emptiness, but as distance. A quiet so complete it allows everything to remain unfinished. No sound carries, no light gathers long enough to feel warm. The universe breathes outward, slow and indifferent. Somewhere within this spreading veil, gravity begins to murmur again. Not loudly, not yet. It speaks through accumulation, through the faint pull one particle feels toward another. Almost nothing, almost ignorable. Over long spans, almost becomes enough. Clouds of dust grow slightly denser. Paths curve subtly. Motion gains bias. This is not formation. It is leaning. Ash begins to remember what it was like to be together. In these clouds, ancient elements brush past one another endlessly. Contact does not mean connection. Most encounters dissolve as quickly as they form, but the universe is generous with repetition. What fails once will fail again, and again, until it doesn't. No one notices. There is no awareness here, No anticipation of planets or oceans or thought. Chemistry practices without purpose. Bonds form because conditions allow them to. They break because conditions change. Nothing is wasted. Everything is rehearsal. Light from distant stars passes through these clouds without acknowledgement. It illuminates particles that do not care to be seen. Even illumination is temporary. Shadows return quickly. The ash continues to drift, shaped only by what it cannot escape: gravity, time, and the quiet inheritance of stellar death. Each atom is complete, yet unfinished, whole, yet waiting. Somewhere within this patient scattering, the ingredients of a future surface already exist, not assembled, but not aligned, simply present. The universe does not announce this. It rarely does. What will one day be called Earth is not here yet, but its chemistry is already travelling, not toward destiny, toward stillness. And in that stillness, matter learns how to wait. Waiting does not feel like patience when nothing is aware of time. The dust does not count the ages it crosses. It does not mark distance as achievement. It simply remains in motion, long enough for motion to begin shaping it. In the cold openness between stars, movement slows until it almost resembles rest. Almost. Gravity does not arrive as force. It arrives as suggestion, a slight preference for nearness. A soft bending of paths that were never straight to begin with. Particles that once travelled alone begin to share trajectories, not because they choose to, but because solitude becomes statistically unlikely over long silence. Clouds thicken, not dramatically, quietly. Density increases by degrees too small for celebration. The universe is not in a hurry to gather itself. It has learned that pressure works best when applied gently. Within these growing veils, ancient ash overlaps its own past. Carbon brushes against carbon. Oxygen circles iron without touching. Hydrogen, still everywhere, still restless, slips through everything, unwilling to stay. The elements remember heat in the way scars remember pain, not as sensation, but as structure. Their behaviours are shaped by conditions that no longer exist. This is how memory survives extinction. Temperature drops further, energy thins, motion slows. In the absence of violence, subtlety becomes powerful. Weak bonds begin to hold simply because nothing disrupts them. Molecules form and dissolve like thoughts never finished. There is no error here. No success. Only continuity. Light continues to pass through, indifferent and brief. It warns nothing. It reveals nothing. It does not stay. Darkness returns without resistance. As clouds swell, gravity's murmur deepens. What was once suggestion becomes tendency. Paths curve more noticeably now. Dust settles into slow rotation, not because it wants to spin, but because collapse rarely happens straight. Angular momentum is inherited without consent. The universe does not correct inefficiency. It allows it to persist until it becomes structure. Within these rotating clouds, pressure increases. Heat returns, not from stars, but from closeness. From particles rubbing against one another, exchanging motion. The warmth is faint, but it is enough to change behaviour, enough to encourage encounters that last slightly longer than before. Ash learns proximity. Some bonds hold, others fail more slowly. Carbon shows its quiet versatility here, forming chains that are neither rigid nor fragile. Oxygen reacts eagerly, reshaping what it touches. Iron, dense and decisive, drifts inward, responding to gravity with fewer questions. This is not chemistry moving toward life. It is chemistry remembering complexity. Time continues without narrative. Millions of years pass as gently as seconds. No marker separates before from after. Only gradual difference accumulates. Clouds contract. Centers form, not points, regions of increased weight, increased heat, increased consequence. What will one day become suns and planets is still indistinct. Everything remains potential, unresolved. It does not mind. It has learned that form is temporary, and process is enough. Collapse accelerates as mass increases. Gravity no longer whispers. It hums. Dust falls inward, compressing, warming, spinning faster as space tightens its grip. Heat rises not as flame, but as friction, as resistance to being close. At the center of some clouds, ignition occurs. New stars begin to burn, repeating an ancient cycle with inherited materials. But not all mass is claimed by fire. Some remains cooler. Some lingers at the edges, flattened into disks by rotation and refusal. These disks carry memory differently. They are shaped not by explosion, but by patience, by leftovers, by what did not fall fast enough to be consumed. Within them, heavier elements concentrate. Iron dust collides and sticks, silicates gather. Carbon compounds weave through gaps. The environment is turbulent but not violent. Collisions happen constantly, yet destruction is rare. Pieces break and rejoin in new arrangements. Fragments grow. Not smoothly, not evenly. Growth here is messy, uneven, full of reversals. Objects form, shatter, reform. Nothing is permanent. Everything is practice. The universe is not disappointed by failure. It has already accounted for it. These fragments carry ancient signatures. Isotopes forged in stellar death persist unchanged. Ratios remain precise. They do not decay quickly. They wait. Inside them, clocks tick silently, marking time without awareness. As fragments grow larger, gravity begins to give them presence. They pull, weakly at first. Then, with increasing insistence, surrounding dust responds. More matter gathers, heat increases again, but now it is localized. Concentrated. Proto-worlds begin to emerge, not as bodies, but as tendencies toward body. Regions where matter prefers to stay, where leaving requires effort. Nothing here is alive. Nothing thinks, and yet something accumulative is happening. Complexity deepens without intention. Structure arises from repetition. Memory embeds itself in matter as arrangement. What will one day be called Earth is still unnamed, unimagined. But the elements that will shape its seas, its rocks, its breathless surface already circle one another, not in harmony, in rehearsal. The ash that was once light is learning weight. It is learning how to settle, and in settling, it prepares for a surface that will one day remember everything it forgets. Settling does not mean rest, it means choosing a place to keep changing. As fragments grow heavier, their paths narrow. What once drifted freely now curves, loops, returns. Orbits form not as circles, but as habits, repeated motions that survive because they are easier than escape. The disk thickens with debris, a quiet congestion of possibility. Collisions continue, countless and indifferent, most are small, leaving only warmth behind. Some are larger, breaking bodies apart, just enough to teach them how to fit better next time. Shattering is not failure here. It is refinement. Edges soften. Angles learn compromise. The universe allows matter to practice staying together by letting it fall apart. Heat gathers in pockets, then disperses. Nothing holds it for long. There is no atmosphere yet, no skin to keep warmth close. Energy leaks into space as easily as it forms. Still, brief moments of intensity leave their trace. Minerals crystallize. Structures lock into patterns that remember pressure even after it fades. Iron continues its inward drift, responding faithfully to gravity's call. It does not resist being central. Density becomes destiny. Lighter materials remain above, circling, colliding, reshaping. This quiet sorting will matter later. For now, it simply happens. Time deepens. Millions of years pass as accumulation thickens into presence. Objects large enough to matter now pull their surroundings with unmistakable authority. Their gravity is not strong, but it is consistent. Dust yields. Pebbles yield. Larger fragments hesitate, then yield too. Growth accelerates not because conditions improve, but because persistence compounds. These growing bodies are warm inside, not molten everywhere, not stable anywhere. Heat rises from impacts and compression, trapped briefly, released slowly. Interiors churn, surfaces remain unfinished, scarred by constant arrival. Nothing smooths them yet. Nothing erases their violence. The ash inside them remembers stars in ways no surface ever will. Isotopes remain intact, clocks still ticking. Ratios whisper of explosions long gone. These bodies carry evidence they will never read. Around them, smaller fragments continue their restless dance. Some fall in, some are flung away, some remain suspended, neither captured nor free. The system does not seek balance. It tolerates imbalance until something holds. In one region of this disk, accumulation becomes stubborn. A body grows large enough to reshape its surroundings decisively. Its gravity clears a path, gathering what remains nearby, leaving emptiness where debris once drifted. The space around it becomes quieter, less crowded, more defined. This is not birth, it is emphasis. The body continues to grow, impact by impact, layer by layer. Each collision adds material and memory. Heat spikes, then fades. Surfaces crack and reform. Interiors differentiate, heavy sinking, light rising. Structure begins to resemble intention, though none exists. Within this growing mass, chemistry waits. Elements do not react freely yet. Temperatures fluctuate too wildly. Conditions change too fast. Bonds form only to be broken by the next arrival. Still, patterns emerge. Minerals settle into repeating arrangements. Crystal lattices hold their shapes even as surroundings shift. Water is present, but not yet water as oceans know it. It arrives bound within minerals, locked inside ice-rich fragments, scattered unevenly. It waits in darkness, unexpressed. Hydrogen remains elusive, slipping through spaces, escaping whenever heat allows. Nothing holds it long. The body turns slowly, gaining spin from every off-center impact. Day and night are not yet concepts. Rotation is simply consequence. The surface never cools enough to keep a memory of itself. Each moment erases the last. Above this forming world, debris continues to fall like thought fragments that never finish forming sentences. Sky is not sky, it is traffic. Constant, unforgiving, beautiful only in its indifference. What will later be called Earth is still incomplete, still undefined. It does not know its shape, it does not know its future. It does not know that it will one day remember things that stars forgot, yet its chemistry is already listening. Iron settles deeper, preparing a heart that will move without thought. Carbon circulates, flexible, uncommitted. Oxygen waits for conditions that will let it react endlessly. Silicon builds scaffolding. Magnesium strengthens it. Calcium prepares to become bone for landscapes not yet imagined. None of this is planned. None of it is guided. It unfolds because physics permits it, because time does not interfere, because the universe rarely stops what is consistent. The ash that was once light is no longer drifting. It is collecting, and in its collection, something like a surface is beginning to rehearse itself. Rehearsal becomes weight before it becomes form. The growing body carries itself with increasing certainty, not because it understands balance, but because imbalance is expensive. Matter prefers what costs less over long time. Gravity teaches this lesson without instruction. What falls inward stays. What resists is removed. Impacts continue, but their character changes. Fewer fragments arrive now, yet those that do arrive strike harder, faster, with histories of their own. Each collision redraws the surface, erasing what briefly cooled, reopening what had almost settled. Fire blooms and fades. Shockwaves ripple through stone that has not yet learned to be solid. Inside, differentiation deepens. Iron sinks more decisively, drawn toward the center where pressure thickens into permanence. The interior grows heavier, denser, more secretive. Heat lingers longer there, trapped by weight. The surface remains restless, fractured, unfinished. This separation is not design, it is consequence. Density arranges itself without preference. Heavy learns to stay below. Light learns to hover. Between them, layers form, transitional, uncertain, forever in motion. The planet in waiting begins to hold itself together not as a single object, but as a collection of behaviors. It spins because it must. It pulls because it can. It fractures because it is struck. Nothing about it is stable, yet nothing about it is temporary either. Instability becomes its longest habit. Around it, the disk thins, debris clears. Space opens. Silence grows where collisions once dominated. Sky becomes darker, emptier. Not peaceful, simply less crowded. The universe removes distractions when repetition has done its work. From time to time, something large arrives, an impact that reshapes everything. The surface melts wholesale. Memory resets. What had almost cooled is liquefied again, stirred, redistributed. These moments are not catastrophic in the way stories imagine catastrophe. They are thorough. They refuse partial outcomes. After each, the planet begins again, cooling, crusting, cracking, repeating. The rhythm is not progress, it is insistence. Water remains mostly hidden, locked within the body, carried downward by sinking minerals. It is patient. It has learned patience from stars. It does not demand expression. It waits for a surface that can hold it without losing it to space. Atmospheres not yet possible. Heat is too violent. Impacts too frequent. Gases escape as easily as they arrive. Hydrogen vanishes almost as soon as it appears, slipping past gravity's weak grasp. What remains clings reluctantly. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur compounds, heavy enough to linger briefly before being stripped away again. The planet breathes in fits and starts, never keeping what it inhales. Still, chemistry persists. In molten regions, elements mix freely. Bonds form under pressure, break under heat, reform as cooling allows. This is not reaction with purpose. It is reaction with opportunity. The planet offers conditions. Matter responds. Crystals grow slowly in cooling rock, locking atoms into repeating lattices. These patterns are memory made rigid. They preserve ratios, distances, angles. They carry information forward without awareness. Long after heat fades, these arrangements remain, evidence of a past state that will never return. The surface begins to develop differences. Some regions cool faster, some remain molten longer, crust thickens unevenly. Plates are not yet plates, but tendencies toward movement are emerging. Weak zones shift, stress accumulates, release follows. The planet learns how to break itself gently. Time presses on without punctuation. The ash inherited from ancient stars is no longer anonymous. It is organized, sorted, layered. Still not alive, still not quiet, but no longer scattered, no longer drifting. The universe has given it a place to practice persistence. Deep within, iron gathers enough heat and weight to prepare for motion. Not yet movement, but readiness, a future stirring. Magnetism sleeps here, unborn but inevitable. The core holds secrets it will not reveal for billions of years. Above it, the mantle churns slowly, cycling heat upward, pulling cooler material down. This motion is not smooth. It stutters, pauses, surges. The planet learns rhythm by failing to keep one. The surface cools again. Dim crust forms. It cracks almost immediately. Lava rises through wounds, sealing them imperfectly. The cycle repeats. Over and over. The planet does not mind repetition. It depends on it. Nothing watches this process. No witness records it. Yet everything that will matter later is being shaped now, quietly, endlessly. Chemistry is being trained by extremes. Matter is being taught resilience by refusal to settle. The ash that was once light is becoming a world. Not finished, not stable, but committed. And in that commitment, something deeper than form is taking hold. A capacity to keep what arrives, to remember what passes, to endure long enough for silence to change its meaning. Commitment deepens without awareness. The planet does not decide to remain. It simply becomes harder to undo. Mass accumulates consequence. Heat learns where it belongs. Gravity tightens its grip not by increasing force but by increasing inevitability. What arrives now is less likely to leave. The bombardment slows not because the universe grows gentle, but because there is less left to collide. The The debris that once crowded this region has been gathered, flung away, or consumed by nearby fire. Space opens. Distance grows quieter. The forming world begins for the first time to experience intervals, moments between impacts long enough for change to persist. Cooling finally gains leverage. The surface does not freeze into peace, it hardens into tension. Crust thickens, contracts, cracks. Heat trapped below pushes upward, searching for release. Volcanoes do not erupt yet as features, they seep. They bleed. Molten rock finds its way through weakness, spreading, cooling, sealing wounds, only to create new ones elsewhere. This is how the planet learns continuity through interruption. Gases linger longer now. Each release from the interior adds to a thin veil that refuses to vanish immediately. Carbon dioxide accumulates. Nitrogen follows, inert but present, a quiet filler of space. Sulfur compounds stain the air with sharpness no nose exists to detect. The sky is heavy, opaque, restless. Hydrogen still escapes. It always will. Lightness has no loyalty to gravity, but heavier gases begin to stay. Not forever, not safely, but long enough to matter. The planet starts to keep what it exhales. Water senses this change without sensing at all. Bound within rock, dissolved in magma, trapped in minerals, it waits for pressure and temperature to align just enough. When released, it rises, not as rain yet, but as vapor. It joins the thickening air, invisible, patient. Cooling continues. Surface temperatures fluctuate less wildly. Extremes soften, though nothing is gentle. Heat no longer dominates every moment. It shares space with endurance. The crust survives long enough to accumulate scars instead of erasing them. Memory begins to have somewhere to stay. Beneath the surface, movement persists. The mantle churns slowly, inexorably, circulating material upward and downward in vast loops that will never complete themselves. This motion is quiet but relentless. It ensures the planet will never truly rest. It ensures renewal through disturbance. Iron at the center grows more concentrated, more molten, more responsive. Rotation begins to matter here. The core stirs not as flow, but as potential. Electrical currents are not yet stable, but the conditions for them are rehearsing. Magnetism waits in the wings, patient as everything else. On the surface, differences deepen. Some regions thicken into proto-continents, lighter, buoyant, resistant to sinking. Others remain dense, willing to descend back into heat. The planet begins to sort itself horizontally as well as vertically. Geography is being imagined without being drawn. The sky remains dim, thick with particulate haze. Light from the young sun struggles to reach the surface. What arrives does not linger. Warmth is muted, scattered. Day and night still have no names, but rhythm begins to matter. Rotation creates cycles. Cycles allow repetition with variation. Variation teaches matter how to respond. Chemical reactions grow more subtle, less explosive, more persistent. In cooling regions, molecules form that can endure beyond a moment. They do not seek complexity, they simply survive longer when conditions allow it. Persistence becomes a quiet filter. Carbon compounds grow more numerous. Chains form, break, reform, rings appear, unstable but intriguing. Oxygen reacts where it can, binding eagerly, reshaping minerals, changing surfaces. Oxidation begins not as rust but as possibility, the planet offering electrons to anything willing to take them. Nothing intends this, everything participates. Rain finally begins, not suddenly, not gently. Vapor condenses into droplets, heavy enough to fall through the thick air. They strike hot rock and vanish in steam, returning upward to try again, over and over. Each cycle steals heat from the surface, cooling it incrementally. Water works patiently, eroding temperature before it erodes stone. Eventually, some droplets survive. They pool briefly in depressions before boiling away, then briefly longer, then longer still. The planet experiments with keeping liquid on its skin. When water finally stays, it does not arrive as ocean. It arrives as memory, as repetition that succeeds. Pools gather, streams form, steam thins, rain intensifies. Heat retreats. The surface changes character. Rock interacts with water, dissolving, precipitating, altering itself chemically. Minerals leach into liquid, salts accumulate. The water becomes heavy with history almost immediately. The ash that was once light now moves differently. It dissolves. It reacts. It circulates between rock and liquid, solid and vapor. Chemistry expands its range of motion, conditions multiply, possibility thickens. Still, nothing lives. Nothing breathes, nothing knows. And yet, the planet has crossed a threshold it will never uncross. It has learned how to keep what arrives, how to hold complexity long enough for it to repeat, how to let memory sink into structure instead of dispersing into silence. The stars that forged its elements are distant now, their light diluted, their voices thin, but their legacy is active, moving through stone, water and heat, not as instruction, as inheritance. The ash that was once light is no longer only ash. It is becoming a place where things can remain unfinished. And unfinished things are the only ones that ever change. Unfinished does not mean fragile, it means available. The planet settles into this state quietly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement. Cooling continues, not toward stillness, but toward tolerance. Extremes soften just enough to coexist. Heat no longer erases everything it touches. Cold no longer forbids movement. Between them, a narrow corridor opens where chemistry can linger. Water spreads, not evenly, never evenly. It gathers where gravity invites it, filling low places with patience learned from falling rain. Basins deepen under their own weight. The surface yields millimeter by millimeter, grain by grain, to liquid persistence. Stone dissolves, particles travel, deposition begins its long, silent authorship. The first seas are restless, warm, mineral-heavy. They do not reflect the sky clearly. They absorb it. Light enters shallow water and disappears quickly, swallowed by suspended particles and chemical haze. Darkness begins just below the surface, a gentle darkness, active, moving. These waters carry stellar inheritance differently now. Elements that once drifted separately are dissolved together. Iron ions colour the depths. Carbon circulates freely, bonding and unbonding with fluid ease. Sulfur lingers, sharp and reactive. Phosphorus appears rarely, but meaningfully, slipping into solution when rock allows it. The oceans do not remember where these elements came from. They only remember how they behave together. Above, the atmosphere thickens further, fed by constant outgassing. Volcanoes release not spectacle, but contribution. Each plume adds complexity: carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, nitrogen. The sky becomes a chemical archive written in motion. Clouds form not as decoration, but as consequence. Rain continues its endless work of exchange. Cycles stabilize. Not fully. Never fully, but enough. Water rises, cools, falls. Heat escapes slowly. Gases circulate. The planet begins to feel like a system instead of an event. Within this system, chemistry grows bolder. Reactions persist longer. Products remain long enough to encounter new reactants. Chains lengthen. Rings stabilize briefly. Patterns repeat with slight variation. Variation accumulates. This is not life rehearsing. It is matter exploring its own grammar. In shallow waters near volcanic vents, heat and minerals create pockets of intensity. Gradients form, hot to cold, acidic to neutral, concentrated to dilute. These gradients matter not because they aim toward complexity, but because they offer contrast. Chemistry responds to difference more readily than to uniformity. Molecules drift through these zones, altered slightly by each passage. Some fall apart, some persist. Persistence has no reward here, only continuation, but continuation is enough. Time stretches again, but differently now, not as emptiness. As layering, each cycle leaves residue. Each interaction adds trace. Memory thickens in water and stone alike. Sediments accumulate, pressing older layers into quiet permanence. Fossils do not exist yet, but the idea of preservation has arrived. Deep beneath the oceans, heat remains restless. The mantle continues its slow circulation, feeding vents, reshaping crust, recycling material endlessly. Nothing stays where it is forever. The planet insists on motion as a condition of keeping. Iron in the core finally stirs with purpose born of inevitability. Rotation and heat align. Electrical currents strengthen. A magnetic field begins to flicker. Not yet stable, not yet protective, but present. Invisible lines extend outward, testing their reach. Some solar wind is deflected. Some still strikes the atmosphere directly, but loss slows. The planet learns how to keep its breath. With protection comes accumulation. Gases linger longer, water loss slows. The sky grows more consistent, less prone to being stripped away by stellar impatience. Stability increases by fractions that matter immensely over long time. Nothing announces this achievement, nothing celebrates. The planet simply notices that what arrives now has a better chance of staying. Chemistry responds. More complex molecules persist in the oceans, not abundant, not dominant, but present. Amino acids appear and vanish. Sugars flicker into existence and dissolve. Lipids gather briefly at interfaces, forming boundaries that do not yet know they are boundaries. These events are rare, fleeting. Most leave no trace, but repetition is generous. Given enough time, even improbability grows familiar. The planet does not guide these processes. It hosts them, provides energy, materials, gradients. The rest unfolds without supervision. Intelligence has not arrived. Intention has not appeared. But selection has begun quietly, not by choice, but by endurance. What remains is what lasts slightly longer than what came before. Stars continue to burn above, distant, indifferent. Their role is finished now, though their influence remains embedded in every reaction, every bond. The ash they scattered has learned new ways to arrange itself. Not better, not worse, simply more intricate. The planet listens still. Not to the stars, to its own interior rhythms, to the circulation of water and rock, to the slow tightening of possibility around patterns that refuse to disappear. Something is approaching, though nothing knows it. Not a moment, not an event, a condition where memory begins to prefer itself. The ash that was once light is nearly done becoming a world. What comes next will not arrive suddenly, it will seep. Seeping has no edge. It does not announce itself as arrival. It spreads quietly, testing surfaces, filling spaces that were never meant to stay empty. The planet allows this because allowance has become its deepest skill. Nothing is forced. Everything is permitted to try. The oceans deepen, not dramatically, but persistently. Rain falls into basins already full, raising levels by fractions that matter only over ages. Shorelines shift. Rock that once baked beneath open sky now dissolves beneath moving water. Boundaries blur. The planet becomes less certain where it ends and where liquid begins. Sediments settle slowly through dark water, carrying minerals ground from ancient crust. They blanket the seafloor in soft layers, pressing older stories downward into pressure and quiet. Heat from below keeps these depths active, never letting them become still enough to forget. Chemistry continues in shadow, rearranging matter without witness. Above the water, the atmosphere moves in thicker patterns. Clouds gather with greater confidence. Storms pass without names. Lightning strikes occasionally, brief violence stitching sky to surface. Energy flashes through air and water alike, leaving altered molecules behind, then vanishing as if nothing happened. These moments do not accumulate as events. They accumulate as change. Near vents and fractures, the seafloor exhales warmth continuously. Minerals precipitate as water cools, building chimneys and porous towers that grow millimeter by millimeter. Within their walls, gradients sharpen, hot inside, cold outside, rich within, sparse beyond. These structures are not designed. They persist because they are allowed to. Water flows through them endlessly, carrying molecules inward, releasing others outward. Reactions repeat. Some fail. Some last longer than before. Repetition carves preference into possibility. Carbon compounds find shelter here, briefly protected from dilution. They gather, separate, gather again. Lipid-like molecules arrange themselves into films, not because they understand enclosure, but because chemistry sometimes favors edges. Inside and outside begin to matter, though nothing knows why. Time presses gently but relentlessly. Millions of years pass without disruption. The planet does not rush this stage. It holds conditions steady long enough for fragile arrangements to repeat themselves, often enough to matter. In shallow seas, sunlight penetrates just far enough to stir reactions without overwhelming them. Photons strike molecules and depart, leaving subtle rearrangements behind. Energy enters without violence. Darkness follows quickly. The rhythm repeats daily, though day and night remain unnamed. Minerals interact with water endlessly. Iron dissolves, oxidizes, settles again. Silica circulates, precipitates, builds scaffolds invisible to any future eye. Phosphorus appears rarely, but when it does, it lingers just long enough to join unfamiliar arrangements before returning to stone. Nothing seeks replication. Nothing seeks survival. Yet some patterns recur simply because they are easy to make under these conditions. Ease becomes influence. Influence becomes prevalence. Deep below, the core continues its slow stirring. The magnetic field strengthens, wrapping the planet in invisible insistence. Solar wind bends, slides past, loses interest. The atmosphere thickens further, no longer easily stripped away. Water remains. The planet has learned retention. With retention comes accumulation. With accumulation comes chemistry that does not reset entirely each cycle. Traces remain, scaffolds persist, memory deepens. This memory is not stored in minds. It is stored in environments, in the way water flows through stone, in the way heat rises and cools, in the way certain molecules encounter one another more often than chance would suggest. The planet is no longer merely hosting reactions, it is shaping them by continuing to exist. Stars fade further into background presence. Their light still warms, their gravity still anchors, but their role as authors has ended. They have become ancestors, present only through what they left behind. The ash they scattered has become wet, warm, restless. It circulates endlessly, refusing to settle into final arrangements. The planet resists completion. It resists silence. Somewhere within these repeating unremarkable motions, chemistry begins to remember what it has already done. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through persistence, structures lasting long enough to encounter themselves again. Feedback appears quietly. A reaction produces conditions that favor its own repetition. A molecule alters its surroundings just enough to make its formation slightly more likely next time. These differences are vanishingly small, but time is generous with small advantages. Nothing observes this threshold. No line is crossed, no boundary declared. The planet simply continues doing what it has learned to do best. Keep what works slightly longer than what does not. The surface remains harsh. The oceans remain dark. The sky remains heavy. There is no gentleness here. Only tolerance. And tolerance is enough. The ash that was once light has become a place where patterns can outlast moments, where memory can exist without thought, where chemistry can begin to fold inward, testing the idea of persistence. What follows will not look like beginning. It will look like continuation that refuses to end. The ash does not know it has arrived. It only knows that it no longer drifts. What once scattered across silence now circulates, through stone, through water, through heat that never fully sleeps. The memory of stars is no longer distant. It is embedded, pressed into rock, dissolved into dark seas, held quietly in the weight of elements that learned how to stay. Nothing has begun yet, but something has learned how to continue. The planet turns, not toward purpose, but toward endurance. And endurance, given enough time, becomes a kind of remembering. What the stars released, the world has kept, and what the world keeps, it will not keep unchanged. But ash never forgets that it was once light. Silence arrives after violence, not as absence, but as depth. It is what remains when brightness has exhausted itself, and motion forgets why it began. Between the dying of one star and the gathering of another, the universe holds its breath. Not deliberately, not consciously, but completely. Here, nothing announces itself. The debris of ancient explosions drifts through space that has no edges to press against. Light thins until it becomes suggestion. Heat dissipates until temperature loses meaning. What remains is distance, so vast it slows thought itself, even where no thought exists. Time spreads wide here, not measured, not marked. It does not move forward so much as it settles outward, layering stillness upon stillness. Millions of years pass the way seconds once did, without friction, without trace. The particles that survived collapse now float in isolation again. Carbon spins slowly, unhurried. Iron drifts with gravity folded inside it like a secret. Oxygen remains reactive, yet with nothing close enough to answer. Hydrogen, everywhere and nowhere, slips between all of them, refusing to belong. This is not emptiness, it is restraint. The universe, having scattered itself, waits to see what will gather without being told to. Silence does work here. It reduces interruption. It allows proximity to matter. Without constant collision, weak forces gain relevance. Slight attractions persist long enough to matter. Small preferences have time to repeat themselves. Dust clouds thicken not because anything pushes them together, but because nothing pulls them apart fast enough. Motion slows, paths curve subtly. The straight line becomes inefficient. Over long spans, inefficiency becomes structure. Gravity does not speak loudly, it never has. It accumulates authority through repetition. Particle curves once, then again, each bend so small it could be dismissed. But dismissal requires attention, and attention does not exist here. Clouds grow heavier by degrees no moment could detect. Density increases quietly. Inside these regions, silence deepens further, muffling even the memory of explosion. Pressure builds not as force, but as inevitability. Temperature rises gently, not from fire, but from closeness, from particles sharing space, from motion rubbing against motion. Heat here is a side effect, not a goal. Within these thickening veils, chemistry resumes its quiet rehearsal. Bonds form briefly, dissolve, form again. Molecules appear without introduction, vanish without farewell. Nothing keeps score, nothing insists. But repetition leaves residue. What happens once may happen again. What happens again may persist slightly longer the next time. Duration becomes influence. Influence becomes tendency. The silence allows this. Without silence, everything would be overwritten by violence. Without silence, memory could not settle. Without silence, complexity would never learn how to stay unfinished. Light passes through these clouds without interruption, indifferent and thin. It does not warm them, does not organize them. It merely visits and leaves. Darkness returns instantly, deeper for having been briefly disturbed. Somewhere within this restrained gathering, rotation begins again. Not dramatically, not everywhere, a subtle bias appears. Motion curves around unseen centers. Disks begin to form, flattened by momentum that has nowhere else to go. The universe does not correct this shape, it permits it. Within these rotating regions, matter sorts itself by patience. Heavier elements drift inward more readily. Lighter ones linger farther out. This sorting is imperfect, full of exceptions, but over time it becomes pattern. Silence does not hurry the pattern. It allows it to mature. The echoes of explosions fade completely here. What remains bears no mark of violence, only of endurance. The ash no longer remembers how it was made. It only remembers how to remain. This is where worlds are not yet imagined but permitted, where chemistry is not ambitious, only persistent, where the universe learns that creation does not require intention, only time that refuses to interrupt itself. And in this quiet between endings and beginnings, gravity leans forward slightly. Not enough to disturb the silence, just enough to prepare it. Preparation does not look like movement. It looks like hesitation that lasts long enough to become direction. Within these quiet clouds, gravity's lean becomes habit. Paths repeat. Loops stabilize. What once wandered now returns, again and again, to nearly the same place. The silence thickens as structure begins to form inside it. Rotation deepens, not as speed but as coherence. Matter learns to share a common motion, circling an absence that is slowly becoming a centre. Nothing marks this centre. It is not solid. It is simply where mass prefers to gather when left alone long enough. Dust grains collide gently here, not shattering, not fusing completely, just touching, exchanging momentum, separating slightly altered. Over time, these exchanges reduce randomness. Motion becomes more predictable. Predictability allows persistence. Silence favors the predictable. Within the rotating cloud, layers emerge. A flattened disk takes shape, broad and diffuse at the edges, denser toward the middle. This is not symmetry chosen, it is symmetry tolerated. Anything that resists this arrangement is slowly removed, flung outward or inward, until it no longer interrupts the pattern. Heat rises again, faintly, born of compression and friction. Not enough to ignite, only enough to encourage encounters that last. Molecules linger. Weak bonds survive moments longer than they once did. These moments accumulate. Chemistry does not awaken here. It stretches. Carbon chains lengthen and shorten repeatedly, learning flexibility without learning purpose. Oxygen reacts and releases, shaping transient compounds that exist just long enough to be replaced. Nitrogen remains aloof, present but uninterested, filling space without participating. Iron dust responds most clearly to gravity's patience. It drifts inward, slowly, decisively, carrying density toward the forming center. Silicates follow, lighter but willing. Ice-rich particles remain farther out, colder, less disturbed. This sorting is incomplete, constantly disrupted by turbulence and collision. But over time, the interruptions weaken. The disk calms. Order does not arrive. Noise simply fades. Silence is doing its work. Light from nearby stars grazes the disk, warming its surface layers slightly, never reaching its depths. Energy enters unevenly, creating gradients, warm above, cool below. Gradients encourage circulation. Circulation encourages mixing. Mixing encourages encounter. Encounter encourages change. Tiny clumps begin to form within the disk, not worlds. Not even objects, just local excesses. Regions where matter lingers slightly longer than elsewhere. These clumps are fragile. Most dissolve back into the disk. Some persist just long enough to attract more material. Persistence is not rewarded. It is merely repeated. Time stretches again, generous and indifferent. Millions of years pass as these clumps appear and vanish. The disk does not notice. It continues rotating, flattening, calming. Each cycle smooths extremes. Each repetition narrows variation. Silence presses gently on everything, encouraging what is quiet, discouraging what is violent. High-energy interactions become rare, low-energy ones dominate. This shift is subtle, but profound. It changes which outcomes are possible. The universe is not choosing creation, it is removing interruption. Within this calmer environment, larger aggregates begin to form. Pebble-sized collections of dust and ice survive long enough to encounter others like themselves. Collisions remain gentle. Accretion becomes possible. These aggregates carry ancient signatures within them, ratios set by stellar death, isotopes frozen in place. They do not know this. They simply hold it. As aggregates grow, their gravity becomes noticeable. Though still weak, they begin to influence nearby particles, altering paths, increasing encounter rates. Growth accelerates slightly, not because conditions improve, but because influence compounds. Still, everything remains provisional. A single strong disturbance could erase these structures entirely. But disturbances are rare now. Silence protects what it shelters. The disk continues to thin as material gathers into fewer, larger regions. Space opens between them. Motion becomes less crowded, more deliberate. The environment favors endurance over spectacle. In this quiet, the echoes of ancient explosions have fully dissipated. What remains bears no trace of violence, only of aftermath. The ash has learned how to rest without stopping. This is where possibility narrows enough to matter, not toward outcome, toward continuity. and continuity given enough time becomes a path. The silence does not end here, it deepens. And within that deepening, something prepares to cross from cloud into presence, without sound, without signal, without awareness. Continuity settles into habit. What once required favourable moments now occurs by default. Aggregates encounter one another often enough that growth becomes ordinary. Not dramatic, not swift. Ordinary in the way erosion is ordinary, inevitable when given time. Within the disk, the largest bodies begin to matter simply by existing. Their gravity does not dominate, but it biases outcomes. Nearby particles curve toward them slightly. Paths that might have missed now graze. Grazes become captures. Captures become accumulation. Nothing announces this change. Silence absorbs it. As bodies grow, their surfaces remain unfinished. Loose collections of fragments held together by mutual patience. They rotate slowly, carrying memory in uneven textures. Each carries a history of collisions, not recorded as narrative, but as density and fracture. Heat remains modest. Compression warms interiors faintly, enough to alter behavior without erasing structure. Ice softens. Volatiles migrate. Materials rearrange themselves subtly, seeking configurations that cost less energy to maintain. The disk thins further. Material that once filled broad regions now concentrates into lanes and gaps. Space opens between forming bodies, not empty, but quieter. Motion becomes more legible. Orbits begin to stabilize, not as perfect circles, but as reliable returns. Silence prefers returns. Light still passes through, now more directly, warming surfaces unevenly. Day-like and night-like intervals emerge, though neither is named. Rotation matters more now. Introducing rhythm where only drift existed before. Rhythm allows repetition with memory. Chemistry responds to rhythm. In shaded regions, cold preserves fragile compounds longer. In warmed zones, reactions proceed, then pause, then resume. This cycling does not aim toward complexity, but it allows it. Molecules experience conditions repeatedly, learning, without learning, what arrangements endure. Iron-rich bodies sink closer to the center of the disk, responding to gravity's long invitation. Lighter materials remain farther out, orbiting with greater leisure. Sorting sharpens, not cleanly, not perfectly, but persistency. This persistence changes scale. The largest bodies now influence not just particles but one another. Their paths adjust subtly through mutual gravity. Resonances appear, ratios of motion that repeat because they are stable. These resonances sculpt the disk, clearing some regions, crowding others. Order emerges as consequence, not plan. Silence allows this order to remain fragile without being destroyed. Disturbances still occur, collisions, close passes, ejections, but they are fewer, less disruptive. The system learns restraint through attrition. Within this restraint, memory accumulates, not memory of events but of conditions. The environment begins to favor what it has already allowed. Stability begets stability. Time stretches again, folding millions of years into smooth continuation. The disk no longer resembles chaos settling. It resembles arrangement sustaining itself. Here, worlds are not born, they are permitted to persist. The ash that once wandered freely now follows paths that repeat. It returns, again and again. Each return reinforces the path. Each path narrows possibility. Narrowed possibility becomes form. Still, nothing is finished. Nothing is secure. Everything remains contingent on silence continuing to hold. The universe, for now, allows it. And in that allowance, the space between explosions becomes something else. Not emptiness, not pause, but preparation refined into structure. What gathers here does not know it is becoming distinct. It only knows how to remain. Remaining becomes heavier than leaving. That is how distinction begins, not as boundary, but as reluctance to disperse. The largest bodies in the disk now carry this reluctance with them, bending nearby motion not through dominance, but through consistency. Their gravity does not command, it persuades. Around them, smaller fragments adjust their paths, not abruptly, but gradually, as if learning a curve by repetition. Near misses become near returns. Near returns become companions. The space around these bodies grows quieter as wandering matter is either gathered or taught to stay away. Silence sharpens, orbits stabilize further, not freezing into perfection, but settling into patterns that survive interruption. Resonances deepen. Ratios of motion repeat often enough to become dependable. The disk begins to look less like a cloud and more like a conversation. Bodies responding to one another through distance and time. Heat remains subdued but present. Interiors of the largest aggregates warm slowly, just enough to allow differentiation to begin. Dense materials drift inward, lighter ones linger above. This sorting is incomplete, interrupted, imperfect, but it establishes tendency. Tendency is enough. Ice migrates. Volatiles shift position, driven by faint gradients of warmth and pressure. Some are lost, some remain. What remains is not chosen. It is simply what conditions allow to stay. Chemistry continues its quiet work, now influenced by scale. Larger bodies hold environments longer. Surfaces persist. Interiors remember pressure. Reactions that once dissolved quickly now leave faint traces. Memory thickens, molecule by molecule. The disk thins further, its material now mostly claimed by a handful of growing presences. Between them, space opens wide and calm. Motion there is simpler, less crowded, easier to predict. The system exhales. Light from the young sun grows steadier, its rhythm more influential as chaos recedes. Cycles of warmth and cool repeat reliably. Reliability allows accumulation. Accumulation allows change that does not immediately erase itself. Silence here is no longer emptiness. It is structure without sound. The echoes of ancient stellar deaths are fully absorbed now. No particle remembers explosion as event, only as composition. Only as ratio. The violence that once scattered matter has been translated into stillness that holds it. Within this stillness, something like inevitability begins to form. Not destiny, not plan, but momentum that resists reversal. The system has learned how to continue without interruption. That learning is difficult to undo. Worlds are still unfinished here. Surfaces remain raw, interiors unsettled. Nothing is safe from change. But change itself has slowed, stretched, given room to layer rather than overwrite. This is the gift of the silence between explosions. It does not create. It preserves enough for creation to become possible later. The ash has been given time to practice staying. And having practiced long enough, it no longer needs silence to hold it together. What comes next will no longer be shaped primarily by distance and drift, but by weight and contact, by surfaces learning how to endure touch. But that is not yet. For now, the universe rests in what it has allowed to remain. And in this resting, preparation quietly completes itself, without sound, without signal, without witness. Some thresholds are crossed not by motion, but by staying still long enough, and silence, having done its work, begins to thin. Silence thins the way fog thins, without leaving. It does not vanish. It loosens its hold just enough for other forces to speak. What remains is quieter than noise, but no longer empty. It is readiness. The system has learned restraint. Motion persists, but without urgency. Orbits repeat, with confidence earned through long survival. Distances hold. Encounters become rarer, more consequential. When they happen now, they change things that will not quickly change back. Weight begins to matter more than drift. The largest bodies carry their mass like memory, bending space gently around themselves. Their presence is felt not through violence, but through inevitability. Nearby paths curve, farther ones adjust. The disk, once broad and forgiving, has become selective. Silence has narrowed possibility. Inside these growing bodies, heat lingers longer than before. Interiors warm just enough to soften, to rearrange, to sort. Differentiation deepens. Cores begin to imagine themselves as centers. Surfaces grow more distinct, no longer erased entirely by every passing moment. This is not transformation. It is commitment. The space between these bodies grows wide and calm. Motion there is simple, almost ceremonial. The chaos of earlier ages has been filtered away, not resolved, but exhausted. What remains is what can endure long repetition without collapse. Light now matters differently. It no longer merely passes through, it warms surfaces. It establishes cycles that repeat without interruption. Day-like and night-like intervals imprint themselves on rotation. Rhythm becomes reliable. Reliability changes chemistry. Reactions that once flickered now recur in familiar ways. Conditions repeat closely enough for outcomes to resemble one another. Similar inputs yield similar results. This is not precision. It is recognition. The universe is not watching this happen. It does not care that thresholds are being crossed. It simply continues allowing what costs least over time. Silence recedes further, making room for contact. Contact will be harsher than drift. It will leave marks. It will introduce scars that remain. But those scars will also be records, evidence that something solid enough existed to be struck. The era of quiet gathering is ending, not abruptly, gently. The ash that once scattered freely has learned how to remain close enough to touch. The space that once protected it has finished its work. It has reduced interruption as much as it can. What follows will no longer be shaped primarily by distance and patience, but by collision and consequence, by surfaces learning what it means to be changed and not undone. Silence does not object. It has already given everything it needed to give. Some phases do not conclude. They simply withdraw, leaving behind arrangements strong enough to continue without them. And so the space between explosions yields to a different kind of making, one that carries weight, heat, and the first true sense of surface. But even now the echoes of silence remain, folded into motion, into orbit, into the way matter still hesitates before it breaks. What gathers next will not drift forever. Listening begins long before sound. It begins as response, the quiet adjustment to pressure, to heat, to repetition. A forming world does not hear, it yields. And in yielding it learns what remains. The bodies that once drifted in careful orbits now carry enough weight to disturb one another. Encounters become unavoidable. Paths cross. Distances shrink. When contact occurs, it is no longer gentle. Stone meets stone with consequence. Heat blooms. Surfaces fracture. Debris scatters, then falls back, altered. This is not chaos returning. It is a different grammar of change. Each collision teaches the growing world something about itself, not as knowledge, but as rearrangement. Layers mix, materials redistribute. What was surface becomes interior. What was hidden is exposed briefly, then buried again. The planet information practices forgetting and remembering at the same time. Heat intensifies within. Compression deepens. Radioactive elements, quiet inheritance from ancient stars, release energy patiently, warming interiors without flame. The world begins to glow from within, not visibly but persistently. This warmth does not demand expression. It simply refuses to vanish. Differentiation accelerates. Iron responds to gravity with obedience learned over aeons. It sinks, gathering toward the center, forming a core that is not yet stable but already decisive. Lighter materials hesitate above it, circulating, melting, separating again. The planet organizes itself by density, not by desire. Above this churning interior, a surface struggles to exist. It cools, cracks, melts again. Nothing lasts long enough to be called land. Each crust is provisional, a rehearsal that will be erased by the next arrival or the next surge of heat from below. And yet, something listens. Not the surface, not the molten depths. The whole listens through balance, through feedback, through the way pressure responds to release and release responds to pressure. The planet begins to adjust itself not toward stability, but toward endurance. Rotation matters more now. The world spins with enough commitment to define direction. Equatorial regions stretch slightly outward. Poles draw inward. Shape emerges. Not perfect, not permanent, but recognizable. The planet learns how to hold itself together while moving. Around it, debris continues to fall, though less frequently. Each arrival adds energy, resets cooling, reshapes chemistry. The planet does not reject these intrusions. It absorbs them, folds them inward, adds them to its growing complexity. Water arrives again and again, carried by impacts, released from minerals, freed by heat. It does not remain yet. It flashes into vapor, escapes, returns, escapes again. The world is not ready to keep it, but it practices. The atmosphere is thin, unstable, repeatedly stripped away by impacts and stellar wind. Gases appear, vanish, reappear. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur compounds linger briefly before loss. The planet exhales constantly, but has not yet learned how to breathe. Still, chemistry listens. In molten regions, elements mix freely. Bonds form under pressure, break under heat, reform as cooling allows. Patterns repeat with slight variation. Repetition trains matter without intention. Certain arrangements recur because conditions favor them. Favor becomes habit. Time presses forward, indifferent to progress. Millions of years pass as the planet repeats these cycles. Impact, melt, cool, fracture, repeat. Nothing improves. Nothing degrades. Everything accumulates. The stars that once shaped this material now watch from distance, their influence reduced to gravity and light. Their voices are faint. The planet listens more closely to itself now, to internal rhythms, to the slow churn beneath its surface, to the tension between heat and release. Listening does not produce answers. It produces adjustment, and adjustment, given enough time, produces character. This world is still violent, still unfinished, still hostile to anything that might one day need gentleness, but it has learned something essential already: how to respond without dissolving, how to change without losing itself entirely. The ash that was once light has become a body that reacts, and reaction is the first quiet step toward memory. Reaction deepens into rhythm. What once happened only when forced now begins to happen because conditions invite it. The planet no longer waits for collision to change itself. Change rises from within, slow and unavoidable. Heat trapped in the interior searches for paths upward. Pressure builds beneath forming crust, testing its strength patiently. Where the surface weakens, it yields, not in eruption yet, but in seepage. Molten rock finds fractures and widens them, lifting itself toward cooler regions where it spreads and hardens. New crust forms not as resolution, but as pores. These pauses grow longer. Between arrivals from above, the surface survives long enough to carry scars forward. Cracks do not vanish immediately. Lava cools and remains solid long enough to fracture again rather than melt entirely. The planet begins to layer its own history instead of erasing it wholesale. Listening now includes memory. The interior continues to sort itself. Iron concentrates further, drawn inward by gravity's steady insistence. The core grows denser, hotter, more coherent. Motion within it becomes organized, not turbulent chaos, but slow circulation shaped by rotation and heat. Electrical currents strengthen. Magnetism begins to rise, tentative but present, stretching invisible lines outward into space. This field is fragile at first. It flickers. It weakens. It returns. But each return lasts slightly longer than the last. The planet practices protection without knowing what it protects. Above, the atmosphere begins to linger. Gases released from the interior no longer vanish immediately into space. Some are deflected by the growing magnetic shield. Others are heavy enough to remain regardless. Carbon dioxide thickens the air. Nitrogen fills the gaps quietly. The sky grows denser, clouded, restless. Light from the sun reaches the surface, filtered now, softened by haze. Heat distributes more evenly. Extremes lessen. Not enough for comfort, but enough for consistency. Consistency matters more than gentleness. It allows repetition to matter. Water senses this shift again. Vapor condenses more often than it escapes. Rain falls harder, longer. Droplets strike hot rock and vanish, but the steam returns quickly, trapped by thicker air. The cycle tightens. Each pass steals heat from the surface, cooling it fractionally. Fractions accumulate. Eventually, liquid remains, not everywhere, not for long at first, but long enough to leave traces. Minerals dissolved, channels etched briefly before being erased. The planet begins to recognize water, not as intrusion, but as participant. In these fleeting pools, chemistry changes pace. Reactions proceed differently in liquid than in melt or gas. Molecules encounter one another more gently, more often. Bonds form that would not survive heat alone. Most dissolve quickly. Some last just long enough to repeat. Repetition trains possibility. The surface grows more diverse. Some regions cool faster, thickening into buoyant crust. Others remain thin, fractured, willing to sink back into heat. The planet begins to develop contrasts, high and low, thick and thin, stable and restless. Geography is not yet present, but its language is forming. Beneath all of this, the mantle churns continuously, circulating material upward and downward in cycles too slow to feel, too steady to stop. This motion ensures that nothing remains isolated forever. What forms at the surface will eventually return inward. What rises from below carries memory of pressure and heat into cooler realms. Listening now includes translation. The planet translates energy into motion, motion into structure, structure into pattern. It does not choose outcomes. It allows feedback to shape what persists. When something works, when a configuration endures slightly longer, it appears again. Time stretches, folds, repeats. Millions of years pass as these processes refine themselves. The planet grows less volatile, not because violence ends, but because violence becomes less total. There is room now for partial survival. Stars flare above, sometimes restless, sometimes calm. Their storms brush against the planet's growing magnetic field, testing it. Some energy penetrates, some is deflected. Each encounter teaches the field how to hold. The planet listens to these tests without fear. Fear requires anticipation. Anticipation does not exist here, only response. What emerges from this long listening is not stability, but resilience. The world learns how to bend without breaking entirely, how to lose parts without losing itself, how to change form while retaining continuity. The ash that was once light now carries weight, heat, motion, and history. It no longer drifts. It turns. It circulates. It reacts. And in reacting, it begins to keep its own counsel, less dependent on the distant past of stars, more shaped by its internal rhythms. The planet has not become gentle, but it has become attentive, and attention, stretched across deep time, will shape what chemistry is allowed to remember next. Attention settles into habit the way sediment settles into water, slowly, invisibly, but with consequence that cannot be undone. The planet does not decide to listen more closely. It simply finds that responding has become easier than resisting. Feedback loops tighten, cause and response begin to recognize one another. Heat no longer roams freely. It follows channels carved by repetition. Beneath the surface, mantle currents trace vast, looping paths carrying warmth upward and returning cooled material downward. These cycles are not smooth. They pause, surge, hesitate. But they repeat often enough to leave imprint. Motion gains memory. Where heat rises persistently, the surface thins, crust weakens, stretches, fractures. Lava ascends not as spectacle, but as necessity, pressure seeking release through paths it has learned before. Each ascent alters chemistry at the surface, delivering fresh minerals, resetting reactions, enriching environments that have learned how to host change. Elsewhere, the crust thickens. Cooling rock grows buoyant, reluctant to sink. These regions endure longer between disruptions. They accumulate layers rather than losing them. Difference deepens. The planet becomes uneven in ways that matter. Listening now includes contrast. Water responds to this unevenness immediately. It flows toward low places, collects, lingers. In these basins, rain no longer vanishes instantly. Pools persist, then expand, then merge. The surface begins to accept water as weight rather than interruption. With persistence comes erosion. Water moves stone grain by grain, carrying it elsewhere, laying it down in quiet places. Sediment builds patiently, recording conditions without commentary. Each layer presses the one beneath it, turning loose fragments into memory held under pressure. The oceans begin to recognize themselves. They are not calm, they are warm, restless, saturated with minerals. Circulation patterns emerge, driven by heat from below and cooling from above. Currents form, dissolve, reform. Nothing settles into final shape, but repetition carves pathways through motion. Within these moving waters, chemistry gains freedom. Molecules drift, collide, linger. Reactions unfold at rates determined by temperature, concentration, and chance. Some arrangements dissolve immediately, others persist long enough to encounter themselves again. Encounter with self matters, not because it signals awareness, but because it allows reinforcement. A molecule that helps create conditions favourable to its own formation will appear more often. This is not intention, it is consequence. Consequence accumulates quietly. At interfaces, where water meets rock, where heat meets cool, where light meets liquid, chemistry becomes especially active. Boundaries encourage difference. Difference encourages reaction. Reaction encourages novelty. The planet does not guide these processes. It holds them. It maintains gradients long enough for fragile outcomes to repeat. That is its only role. Above, the atmosphere continues to thicken. Clouds grow more complex, layered, dynamic. Rain falls in patterns shaped by rotation and heat distribution. Storms travel. Winds learn routes. The sky becomes another system of memory, circulating gases and energy in repeating ways. Lightning flashes occasionally, stitching sky to sea, sea to stone. Energy enters briefly, violently, then dissipates. Molecules rearrange under its passage. Most changes vanish. Some linger just long enough to be incorporated into ongoing cycles. The magnetic field strengthens further, stabilizing into something persistent. Invisible lines arc outward, shaping the flow of charged particles around the planet. Radiation is not eliminated, it is filtered. Filtering matters, retention increases. Water loss slows, atmospheric erosion eases. The planet grows better at keeping what arrives. This does not guarantee gentleness. It guarantees continuity. Within the deep interior, radioactive decay continues its patient work, releasing heat at a pace that ignores surface drama. This steady warmth ensures that motion never ceases entirely. The planet will not freeze into stillness. It will not burn itself out quickly. It has found a tempo that sustains unrest without collapse. Listening now includes pacing. Time presses forward, layering response upon response. Millions of years pass as these systems refine themselves. The planet grows neither calm nor stable. It grows legible. To itself, patterns repeat often enough to become reliable. Reliable patterns shape chemistry by narrowing what is likely. Likelihood becomes influence. Influence becomes direction without intent. The stars overhead continue their distant burning, but they no longer dominate the planet's story. Their light is one influence among many. Their gravity, one background constant. The world listens more closely to what happens beneath its own surface, within its own waters, under its own sky. The ash that was once light has learned how to host complexity without collapsing under it. It has learned how to let differences persist side by side. It has learned how to remember conditions rather than events. This listening does not produce answers. It produces environments, and environments given enough time begin to answer questions that were never asked. What follows will not announce itself as change. It will arrive as continuation growing more selective, chemistry narrowing its attention toward arrangements that endure. But that narrowing has not yet reached its quiet edge. For now, the planet listens. And what it hears most clearly is repetition. Repetition settles into something heavier than habit. It becomes expectation, not held by mind but by matter. When conditions recur often enough, the planet begins to behave as though it anticipates them, adjusting before extremes arrive, redistributing energy before imbalance grows too loud. This is not foresight, it is tuning. The surface now survives long enough to accumulate difference. Highlands persist. Lowlands deepen. Water recognizes pathways and returns to them again and again, until flow itself becomes a kind of memory etched into stone. Rivers are not yet gentle, but they are consistent. They know where to go because they have gone there before. Sediments continue their quiet work, pressing time into layers. Each deposit records temperature, chemistry, motion. No archive is intentional, nothing is labelled, but nothing is lost. Pressure keeps stories even when surfaces forget them. Beneath the oceans, vents breathe steadily, heat rises, minerals precipitate, porous structures grow and collapse and grow again. Within their shifting interiors, chemistry repeats with variations small enough to matter. Molecules linger in protected spaces, encountering one another often enough to recognize familiarity. Familiarity is not awareness, but it is selection's first shadow. The atmosphere circulates with increasing confidence. Winds trace latitudes, storms follow routes shaped by rotation and heat. Rain returns to the same regions more often than others. Climate, still harsh, still volatile, begins to show preference. Preference narrows chaos. The magnetic field holds firm now. Not perfect, not constant, but persistent. It deflects enough to matter, but the planet loses less of itself each cycle. What arrives has a better chance of staying. Retention deepens memory. Listening becomes internal. The planet responds less to every external disturbance and more to its own established rhythms. Impacts still arrive, but they no longer reset everything. Stellar storms still strike, but they no longer strip the sky bare. The world absorbs disturbance instead of being erased by it. This absorption changes chemistry's tone. Reactions do not merely occur. They recur in familiar environments, warm shallows, mineral-rich depths, interfaces where water meets rock and light fades gently into dark. Certain arrangements appear more often because the planet now holds the conditions that allow them to appear again. No line is crossed here. No threshold announces itself. But narrowing continues. Possibility does not vanish. It concentrates. What persists is not what is strongest, nor what is most complex, but what fits best within the rhythms the planet has learned to keep. Endurance becomes compatibility. Compatibility becomes quiet influence. The stars overhead continue burning indifferent, ancient. Their role is now background, a steady offering of light and gravity. The planet's attention has turned inward, towards circulation, layering, and return. Listening has done its work. The world has become a place where change does not erase itself completely, where memory can settle into structure, where chemistry is allowed to remember yesterday without needing to know what yesterday was. The ash that was once light has become a listener that keeps time without counting it. And what listens long enough eventually begins to answer, not with words, not with intention, but with persistence that refuses to disperse. Some truths do not arrive as discoveries. They arrive as arrangements that stop disappearing, and somewhere within this attentive world, chemistry grows quiet enough to begin choosing. Without ever knowing that it has, water does not arrive as peace. It arrives carrying heat's afterimage, carrying minerals torn from stone, carrying the memory of fire dissolved into motion. The oceans form not as mirrors of the sky, but as archives of what the planet has endured. They spread slowly, basin by basin, filling depressions carved by impact and fracture. Each basin holds water differently. Some remain shallow and warm, easily stirred by wind and heat. Others deepen into darkness quickly, insulated from surface change. The planet does not unify them. It allows difference to persist. These early seas are heavy, saturated, dense with dissolved metals and salts. Iron stains the water, giving it depth and weight. Sulfur sharpens its chemistry. Carbon circulates freely, bonding and unbonding without rest. The oceans are not hospitable. They are expressive. Heat rises into them constantly from below. Vents breathe warmth and minerals into the depths, creating columns of motion that never fully disperse. Hot water rises, cools, sinks again. Circulation establishes itself not as pattern, but as insistence. The oceans refuse stillness. Light enters reluctantly. The thick atmosphere scatters it before it reaches the surface. What penetrates the water vanishes quickly, absorbed by particles and chemistry. Darkness begins just below the skin of the sea. A living darkness, active and warm. In this dimness, memory behaves differently. Water does not preserve shapes the way stone does. It preserves motion. It remembers through circulation, through the way currents return to familiar paths, through the way heat and chemistry reappear in the same regions again and again. Fire's memory is everywhere here, not as flame, but as energy still moving through liquid. Heat alters reaction rates. Pressure alters solubility. Minerals precipitate where conditions allow, then dissolve elsewhere. Nothing stays fixed, everything participates. Along the seafloor, volcanic rock meets water and changes immediately. Basalt fractures, ions leach out. New minerals form on contact, creating surfaces that did not exist moments before. These surfaces matter not because they endure, but because they invite interaction. Water moves across them endlessly, carrying molecules into contact, pulling others away. Reactions repeat not because they succeed, but because the ocean does not stop offering chances. At boundaries, where hot meets cool, where solid meets liquid, where mineral meets dissolved gas, chemistry becomes more adventurous. Differences sharpen. Gradients form. Gradients invite motion. Motion invites change. The planet listens through its oceans now. It listens to how heat distributes itself in water more evenly than in stone, to how pressure increases gently with depth, creating layers that do not mix easily, to how circulation can carry material vast distances without erasing it entirely. These lessons matter. In shallow regions, evaporation concentrates minerals. Water thins, salts thicken. When rain returns, dilution follows. This cycle repeats endlessly, teaching chemistry how to tolerate fluctuation. Some molecules dissolve easily, deciding the bodies of Timania, others resist. Resistance becomes influence. Storms disturb the surface frequently. Winds push water into waves, waves into shores, shores into erosion. Sediments return to the sea, carrying with them new materials, new possibilities. Nothing remains isolated for long. Deep below, the mantle continues its slow dialogue with the oceans. Heat rises. New crust forms. Old crust sinks back into pressure. The boundary between water and stone is never stable. It shifts, cracks, reforms. The seafloor is alive with change, though nothing living exists. Time presses forward gently here, cushioned by water's capacity to absorb energy. Extremes soften. Reactions that would shatter in heat or freeze in cold now proceed steadily. The oceans moderate the planet's voice. Within this moderation, chemistry begins to explore combinations that require patience. Molecules meet repeatedly. Some separate quickly. Some linger long enough to encounter a second time. Repetition carves preference. The oceans do not know they are preparing anything. They simply remember fire well enough to carry it without being consumed by it. And carrying fire without destruction is a skill that changes what matter is allowed to attempt. The ash that was once light now moves endlessly through liquid darkness, stirred by heat remembered from the planet's birth and stars long gone. What will come of this motion is not yet visible, but the oceans are learning how to keep memory fluid instead of fixed. And fluid memory has a way of finding forms stone never could. Movement becomes the ocean's language, to not speak in shapes or edges, but in return. Currents trace invisible paths again and again, guided by heat from below and cooling from above. Where these paths intersect, chemistry gathers like sediment in a bend of a river. Never permanent, always revisited. The surface and the depths learn to differ. Above, water warms and cools in rhythm with light filtered through cloud and haze. Below, temperature changes slowly, governed by pressure and proximity to the planet's restless interior. Between them, layers form that resist mixing. These layers hold difference gently, allowing reactions to proceed without being overwhelmed. Difference becomes a resource. Near the seafloor, where vents breathe continuously, water carries minerals freshly released from stone. Iron enters solution, reactive and eager. Sulfur follows, sharp and willing to rearrange bonds. Hydrogen slips through everything, restless as ever, but present long enough to matter. These ingredients do not wait for instruction. They respond to gradients, Hot water rises. Cool water sinks. In between, chemistry unfolds repeatedly. In similar ways, molecules form under pressure, drift outward, cool, alter, dissolve. Some return to vents altered. Some are lost to dilution. Some persist just long enough to encounter familiar conditions again. Encounter is everything. Porous mineral structures grow around vents. Fragile and temporary, they channel water through narrow passages, concentrating molecules, slowing their escape. Inside these passages, reactions repeat more often than chance alone would allow. This repetition is quiet, relentless, uncelebrated. Nothing here seeks complexity. Complexity emerges as residue of persistence. At the boundaries where these mineral towers meet open water, conditions shift abruptly. Hot becomes cool, concentrated becomes dilute. Reactions that require contrast thrive here. Molecules adapt, not consciously, but structurally, to survive these transitions, those that cannot simply disappear back into the sea. This disappearance is not punishment, it is sorting. In shallower waters, sunlight begins to play a subtler role. It does not dominate chemistry yet, but it participates. Photons strike molecules, rearranging bonds, then vanish. Most changes dissolve immediately. A few persist long enough to join ongoing cycles. Daylight and night-like rhythms repeat. Light arrives, leaves, returns. Each cycle offers energy without permanence. Chemistry learns to respond to pulses rather than constants. Along coasts that do not yet deserve the name, tides begin to matter. The moon's distant pull lifts water slightly, then releases it. Wetting and drying repeat endlessly, concentrating and diluting dissolved compounds. Pools form, evaporate, refill. Each cycle alters chemistry gently but persistently. Evaporation thickens solutions. Rain thins them again. Molecules experience extremes without being destroyed. Some arrangements tolerate this, others do not. Tolerance becomes influence. Sediments settle through these waters constantly, carrying minerals from erosion above. They blanket surfaces, then are disturbed again by currents and heat. Burial and exposure repeat, teaching matter how to exist under pressure and then return to motion. Time deepens without slowing. Millions of years pass as these processes refine themselves. The oceans grow broader, deeper, more interconnected. Circulation becomes global. Chemistry travels vast distances without losing identity entirely. The sea becomes the planet's most effective memory, carrying material across time and space. Fire's legacy remains present but subdued. Heat no longer dominates. It collaborates. It provides energy without erasure. The ocean absorbs it, distributes it, softens it. This collaboration changes scale. Reactions that once occurred only near vents now occur elsewhere, carried by currents, reproduced under slightly different conditions. Variation spreads. Variation allows selection to operate quietly, favoring what can endure change without losing structure. Nothing watches this selection. Nothing names it, but its influence deepens. The oceans begin to favor chemistry that can cycle, form, dissolve, reform, without exhausting itself. Molecules that survive both heat and dilution appear more often. Molecules that can bind and unbind without breaking entirely persist longer. Persistence thickens the sea's chemical vocabulary. The planet listens through this motion. It adjusts heat flow, circulation patterns, atmospheric exchange, not deliberately, but through feedback that rewards what maintains balance. Extremes are softened. Stability increases without stillness. The ash that was once light now circulates endlessly through liquid pathways, carrying the memory of stellar fire in diluted, usable form. Energy no longer arrives as catastrophe. It arrives as opportunity repeated. What is being prepared here is not life. It is endurance under variation. And endurance under variation is the quiet requirement for anything that will one day remember itself. The oceans continue moving, remembering fire not as destruction, but as warmth that can be carried without being consumed. What follows will not rise from the depths suddenly. It will seep outward, carried by currents, folded into cycles, until chemistry grows familiar enough with itself to hesitate before dissolving. Familiarity grows quietly. not as recognition but as recurrence that resists erasure. In water, nothing stays still long enough to be named, yet some patterns return often enough to leave an impression. The oceans learn through motion what stone learns through pressure. Currents trace roots that deepen with time. Warm water rises where heat is offered, cool water sinks where release is possible. These exchanges repeat with such reliability that chemistry begins to expect them, not consciously but structurally. Molecules encounter similar conditions again and again, and those encounters leave residue. At the margins of continents not yet fixed, shallow seas stretch and retreat. Tides lift water over rock, then draw it back, leaving films behind. Sunlight warms these films briefly. Evaporation concentrates what remains. Salts thicken. Organics, still rare and fragile, are pressed closer together by the absence of water. Then rain returns, restoring motion, dispersing what survived. This rhythm teaches tolerance. Some arrangements endure drying and return intact. Others fragment and vanish. Endurance here is not strength. It is flexibility, the ability to be altered without being undone. Flexibility repeats. Repetition becomes prevalence. Mineral surfaces participate endlessly. Clays swell and contract with water's presence. Their layered structures offer edges and pockets where molecules can linger. Adsorption slows escape. Concentration increases locally. Reactions proceed that would be impossible in open water alone. Nothing about this is intentional. The planet does not direct molecules toward surfaces. Water simply moves. Stone simply waits. Where they meet often enough, chemistry learns to pause. In deeper waters, pressure increases gently with depth, changing what is possible without violence. Gases dissolve more readily. Reactions proceed differently. The ocean becomes stratified not only by temperature, but by opportunity. Different depths offer different rules, and chemistry explores them all without preference. Heat from vents continues to rise, feeding plumes that carry altered chemistry upward. These plumes drift, disperse, mix, seeding distant waters with products formed far below. The ocean becomes interconnected, its memory no longer local. What happens in one place eventually influences another. This connectivity matters. It allows patterns to spread without needing to form everywhere independently. Once an arrangement appears, it can be carried, altered slightly, and reintroduced under new conditions. Variation multiplies without starting from nothing each time. Lightning continues to stitch sky and sea sporadically. Each strike rearranges molecules briefly, injecting energy that dissipates quickly. Most changes are lost. A few persist long enough to be taken up by ongoing cycles. Energy arrives not as command, but as punctuation. The atmosphere exchanges constantly with the oceans. Gases dissolve, escape, return. Carbon dioxide moves freely between air and water, altering acidity, influencing reaction pathways. Methane lingers briefly before oxidation. Nitrogen remains inert, present but patient. This exchange stabilizes extremes. The ocean buffers the sky moderates the ocean. Together they create a middle ground where chemistry can proceed without being erased by excess. Time presses forward, layering repetition upon repetition. Millions of years pass as these cycles refine themselves. The oceans grow more coherent, not calmer, but more patterned. Motion becomes predictable enough to sustain fragile arrangements. Within this predictability, chemistry narrows its attention, not toward complexity for its own sake, but toward arrangements that survive cycling. Molecules that can be altered and restored persist. Those that require static conditions disappear. Persistence does not require awareness. It requires compatibility with motion. The planet listens to this compatibility. It adjusts circulation subtly through heat flow and rotation. It maintains gradients long enough for chemistry to practice endurance. It does not intervene, it permits. The ash that was once light now moves through water as memory in transit, never fixed, never lost. Fire's energy is diluted, spread thin, made useful without destruction. This dilution is not weakness, it is invitation. Something is being rehearsed here, not as event, but as habit, the ability for arrangements to return after disturbance, to lose shape and regain it, to dissolve and reform. The oceans do not know what they are preparing. They only know how to keep moving without forgetting entirely, and that knowledge, held in liquid darkness, begins to narrow the field of what can persist next. Return becomes the ocean's quiet signature. What leaves does not vanish entirely. It comes back altered, thinned, enriched, changed just enough to matter. The sea learns this pattern and keeps it. Circulation folds the past into the present without naming either. Across wide distances, waters exchange their histories. What formed near heat drifts toward cold. What condensed in shallows sinks into depth. Mixing is never complete. Layers resist one another gently, allowing differences to persist long enough to shape reaction. The ocean becomes a keeper of contrasts rather than a blender. These contrasts invite chemistry to choose without choosing. At interfaces where layers meet, molecules gather again and again. Density changes slow movement. Boundaries sharpen attention. Reactions occur that require patience, proximity, and time. Most fail. Failure leaves no mark. But success, small, temporary success, returns more often than chance would allow. This return is enough. Sediments continue to fall, pressing chemical history into quiet darkness. Burial slows motion, preserves arrangement. Heat alters what is buried, then releases it again through circulation. Nothing is sealed forever. Everything is given time to change and time to persist. The oceans widen their reach. Basins connect. Currents link distant regions into a single moving body. Chemistry now travels the globe, carried by water that remembers where it has been, only through what it carries with it. Memory is not location. It is composition. Fire's legacy remains present in every reaction. Heat still rises from below, still feeds circulation, still drives difference. But fire no longer dominates. It has been absorbed into rhythm, transformed from force into background pulse. The oceans know how to carry it without being consumed. Light continues to arrive unevenly. In some regions, it penetrates just enough to alter chemistry gently. In others, darkness remains complete. Both matter. The alternation between light and dark, energy and rest, teaches molecules how to tolerate interruption without collapse. Tides continue their endless lifting and releasing. Shorelines breathe. Wet becomes dry, dry becomes wet. Concentration follows dilution. Dilution follows concentration. Each cycle narrows what can endure. Narrowing does not remove possibility, it refines it. The atmosphere listens too, exchanging gases continuously, adjusting pressure, redistributing heat. Storms form and fade. Winds trace familiar paths. The planet's outer layers learn cooperation without coordination. Within this cooperation, chemistry grows quieter, not simpler, steadier. Reactions repeat under similar conditions often enough to become expected outcomes. Expected does not mean guaranteed, it means allowed. Allowed arrangements persist. Nothing here announces a beginning, nothing marks a threshold. The oceans do not suddenly become something else. They deepen into what they have already been practicing. Motion that remembers, heat that circulates, chemistry that returns. The ash that was once light is now everywhere in the water, dissolved, suspended, precipitated, carried endlessly through cycles that do not conclude. Stellar inheritance has been softened, diluted, made patient, and patience changes what matter can attempt. What comes next will not rise from the sea as revelation. It will condense quietly within it, shaped by repetition, protected by motion, tested by return. The ocean will not notice when chemistry begins to hesitate before dissolving, when some arrangements begin to resist disappearance just a little longer than before. The sea will keep moving either way, but what it carries will begin to change how it moves. Some memories do not settle into stone, they remain fluid, waiting for the moment they can hold themselves together. And in the water's endless return, the first quiet narrowing continues. Carbon does not hurry, it never has. Forged in pressure older than any surface, scattered by endings that did not pause to look back, it learned early that endurance belongs to what can change without breaking. In the oceans, in the air, in the quiet exchange between water and stone, carbon waits, not passively, but flexibly. It moves everywhere. Dissolved in seawater, drifting through atmosphere, locked briefly into rock before being released again. It borrows them. It borrows them. This borrowing is not careless. Carbon leaves traces of itself behind, subtle alterations in chemistry that invite return. In water, carbon forms bonds easily, then releases them just as easily. Chains assemble, collapse, reassemble in altered forms. Rings appear briefly, stable enough to be noticed by repetition, unstable enough to disappear without resistance. Nothing lasts. Everything returns differently. This is carbon's gift. The oceans do not suddenly become something else. They deepen into what they have already been practicing. Motion that remembers, heat that circulates, chemistry that returns. The ash that was once light is now everywhere in the water, dissolved, suspended, precipitated, carried endlessly through cycles that do not conclude. Stellar inheritance has been softened, diluted, made patient, and patience changes what matter can attempt. What comes next will not rise from the sea as revelation. It will condense quietly within it, shaped by repetition, protected by motion, tested by return. The ocean will not notice when chemistry begins to hesitate before dissolving, when some arrangements begin to resist disappearance just a little longer than before. The sea will keep moving either way, but what it carries will begin to change how it moves. Some memories do not settle into stone, they remain fluid, waiting for the moment they can hold themselves together. And in the water's endless return, the first quiet narrowing continues. Carbon does not hurry, it never has. Forged in pressure older than any surface, scattered by endings that did not pause to look back, it learned early that endurance belongs to what can change without breaking. In the oceans, in the air, in the quiet exchange between water and stone, carbon waits, not passively, but flexibly. It moves everywhere. Dissolved in seawater, drifting through atmosphere, locked briefly into rock before being released again. It borrows them. It borrows them. This borrowing is not careless. Carbon leaves traces of itself behind, subtle alterations in chemistry that invite return. In water, carbon forms bonds easily, then releases them just as easily. Chains assemble, collapse, reassemble in altered forms. Rings appear briefly, stable enough to be noticed by repetition, unstable enough to disappear without resistance. Nothing lasts. Everything returns differently. This is carbon's gift. Where other elements demand fixed roles, carbon tolerates ambiguity. It binds in multiple directions, accepts rearrangement, survives interruption. In an environment shaped by cycles and gradients, this flexibility becomes influence. The oceans provide endless rehearsal space. Warm shallows invite evaporation and concentration. Depths offer pressure and protection. Interfaces, where rock meets water, where heat meets cool, present constant variation. Carbon explores all of them without preference. It does not seek complexity, it tolerates it. In shallow pools, drying concentrates carbon-bearing molecules until proximity forces encounter. Bonds form under constraint, not intention. When water returns, some bonds dissolve immediately. Others resist, not because they are strong, but because their shape allows it. Shape becomes memory. Rain does not ask what it erases. Carbon does not ask what remains. Along mineral surfaces, carbon compounds linger longer than in open water. Clays hold them briefly, slowing their escape. Reactions repeat in these sheltered spaces. Products accumulate just enough to be noticed by chance. Chance repeats itself generously over time. Deep near vents, carbon meets heat and pressure that rearrange it more radically. Simple compounds transform into more elaborate ones, only to be carried upward and thinned by cooler waters. Many dissolve back into simplicity. A few retain altered forms long enough to matter. Matter does not remember events. It remembers arrangements that return. The atmosphere participates quietly. Carbon dioxide dissolves into water, reacts with minerals, returns to air. Methane appears briefly, altered by heat or light, then vanishes. Exchange continues endlessly. The sky and sea share carbon without argument. This sharing matters. It ensures that no single environment holds carbon long enough to exhaust its possibilities. Variation is maintained. Carbon encounters difference repeatedly, and difference invites experimentation without direction. Time presses forward with its usual generosity. Millions of years pass as carbon cycles through these roles: gas, solute, solid, back again. Nothing accumulates fast, nothing resolves, patience deepens. Within this patience, repetition does its quiet work. Certain arrangements recur slightly more often because conditions favour them. Favour does not guarantee survival, it merely increases encounter. Encounter increases persistence. Persistence increases influence. Influence here is subtle. Carbon does not dominate chemistry. It infiltrates it. It threads through reactions, linking processes that would otherwise remain separate. It becomes connective tissue in a system that values return over arrival. The planet listens to this without judgment. It continues offering gradients, cycles, boundaries. It does not protect carbon. It does not prioritize it. Carbon survives because it fits the tempo of change the planet has learned to keep. Fire's memory still touches these processes faintly. Heat driving reactions, pressure altering bonds. But fire no longer commands. It collaborates. Carbon carries energy forward without being consumed by it. Some arrangements begin to linger longer than before. Not stable. Not permanent. Just slower to dissolve. These arrangements encounter themselves again under similar conditions. Feedback appears, not as loop, but as echo. Echoes matter. They allow chemistry to rehearse without starting over each time. Carbon becomes central not by force, but by reliability. It returns. Again and again. Each return slightly altered, slightly more suited to the environment that receives it. Nothing observes this patience. Nothing celebrates it. Yet patience accumulates weight over deep time. It narrows what is likely without eliminating what is possible. The ash that was once light now moves through carbon's quiet adaptability, learning how to persist in a world that refuses stillness. Flexibility becomes a form of memory. Memory becomes a form of endurance. What carbon is practicing here is not life, it is continuity under change. And continuity, when held long enough, begins to resemble intention, even where none exists. Patience thickens when nothing interrupts it. Carbon continues its wandering, not as aimless drift, but as circulation shaped by environments that have learned how to keep memory without holding it too tightly. The planet offers no sanctuary, only rhythm. Carbon adapts by moving with that rhythm rather than against it. In the oceans, dissolved carbon drifts through layers that resist mixing. Each layer offers different rules: temperature, pressure, acidity. Carbon responds by rearranging itself repeatedly, testing bonds under varied conditions. Some bonds loosen easily, others flex without breaking. Flexibility proves valuable here, though value is never named. Where water brushes stone, carbon lingers. Mineral surfaces slow motion, allowing molecules to pause long enough to encounter one another repeatedly. Clays swell and contract, opening and closing spaces that shelter reactions briefly. Inside these pockets, carbon chains lengthen, collapse, lengthen again. Nothing is protected permanently. Everything is given time. Time is generous. In drying pools, carbon-bearing compounds are pressed closer together as water retreats. Proximity forces interaction. Some arrangements form only under this constraint, then dissolve when dilution returns. A few resist dissolution, not through strength, but through shape that tolerates water's return. Shape becomes strategy without awareness. Rain arrives without memory. Carbon remains. Sunlight participates cautiously. Photons strike molecules, rearranging bonds, then vanish. Most changes are erased immediately by surrounding water. A small fraction persists long enough to join ongoing cycles. Energy arrives not as command, but as suggestion, repeated often enough to matter. At depth, mere vents and fractures, heat reshapes carbon more radically. Pressure compresses bonds into unfamiliar forms. Water saturated with minerals carries these forms upward, thinning them, cooling them, exposing them to conditions that challenge their stability. Many dissolve. Some survive altered, neither what they were nor what they will become. Survival here is temporary. Temporary is enough. The atmosphere continues exchanging carbon freely with the sea. Carbon dioxide dissolves, reacts, precipitates, returns. This constant movement prevents stagnation. Carbon is never allowed to specialize too narrowly. It remains versatile by necessity. Versatility becomes persistence. Across millions of years, repetition narrows chemistry's attention. Certain carbon arrangements appear more often simply because they fit more environments without failing immediately. These arrangements are not optimal. They are tolerant. Tolerance repeats. Repetition leaves faint tracks in chemical space. Reactions begin to resemble one another across distant regions because conditions echo one another. The ocean's circulation spreads these echoes, carrying familiar arrangements into new contexts where they are tested again. Testing does not judge, it filters. Carbon compounds that endure cycles of heat and cool, concentration and dilution, light and dark, appear again and again. Their persistence is not guaranteed, it is merely slightly more likely than disappearance. Likelihood compounds quietly over time. The planet does not assist this process. It maintains gradients, it continues circulation, it allows variation. Carbon survives by matching the planet's tempo, not by resisting it. Deep within sediments, buried carbon experiences pressure that alters it slowly. Layers press downward, transforming loose arrangements into denser forms. Heat from below rearranges bonds further. Some carbon becomes locked into rock for long spans, only to be released again through uplift and erosion. Burial is not exile, it is delay. Delay preserves possibility. When released, altered carbon re-enters cycles carrying memory of pressure and heat. It behaves differently now, opening new pathways for reaction. These pathways do not replace old ones, they coexist. Complexity grows sideways rather than upward. Sideways growth is quiet. Quiet growth lasts. Nothing here accelerates. Carbon's patience resists urgency. It does not rush toward complexity. It tolerates it when it appears, lets it dissolve when it cannot endure, tries again elsewhere under slightly different conditions. The oceans continue moving. The atmosphere continues exchanging. The surface continues eroding and rebuilding. Within all of this motion, carbon threads itself through processes like a question that never demand an answer. Some arrangements begin to assist their own return indirectly. A molecule alters its surroundings slightly, changing acidity, binding minerals, modifying surfaces, making similar reactions more likely nearby. This is not intention, it is consequence that echoes. Echoes thicken. Carbon does not notice this. The planet does not notice this. Only time notices, by allowing the echo to repeat often enough to matter. Fire's memory remains present but subdued. Energy still drives reactions but rarely overwhelms them. Carbon carries energy forward gently, dispersing it into bonds that can be rearranged rather than destroyed. This gentleness is not kindness. It is compatibility with a world that refuses stillness. What is being practiced here is not life, not awareness, not direction. It is continuity under variation, the ability to exist through change without losing coherence entirely. Carbon's patience teaches chemistry how to hesitate before dissolving, how to return after being undone, how to remain unfinished without vanishing. The ash that was once light now rests briefly in forms that remember themselves just long enough to appear again. And appearance, repeated often enough, begins to narrow what chemistry is willing to forget. Hesitation deepens. Not in time, but in tendency. Carbon does not remain longer because it is protected. It remains because it has learned how to fail slowly. Bonds loosen without collapsing. Structures bend without shattering. This slowness matters more than strength ever could. Across the oceans, carbon-bearing molecules begin to encounter familiar conditions often enough to behave as if those conditions are expected. Warm shallows, mineral edges, cycles of drying and return. Each repetition removes surprise. Surprise wastes energy. Familiarity conserves it. Conservative favors endurance. Along clay-rich shores and sedimented basins, carbon lingers in layered environments that change gradually rather than abruptly. Pressure increases millimeter by millimeter. Heat fluctuates gently. These slow gradients allow rearrangement without erasure. Molecules adjust instead of dissolving outright. Adjustment accumulates. Some arrangements begin to persist through multiple cycles unchanged. Not many. Not reliably, but enough to matter over long spans. When these arrangements reappear, they do so not as copies, but as echoes, close enough to recognize themselves chemically, different enough to explore variation. Variation is tolerated here. The oceans no longer treat chemistry as isolated reactions. They move products from place to place, subjecting them to new tests without discarding them entirely. A compound formed in one environment may fail in another, then survive again when carried back toward familiarity. Return becomes influence. In deeper waters, pressure stabilizes some carbon structures that would dissolve near the surface. In shallows, light alters others just enough to make them more flexible. The ocean offers no single rule. It offers contrast. Carbon thrives by moving between contrasts without committing fully to either. Movement becomes strategy without thought. Sediments continue to bury carbon temporarily, pressing it into altered forms that retain shape under stress. Burial slows reaction, preserves structure. When uplift returns these materials to circulation, they carry altered potential back into active chemistry. Delay becomes diversification. Fire's memory still moves through these processes faintly. Heat from below reshapes bonds slowly. Pressure from above refines them. Carbon does not resist this shaping. It accommodates it. Accommodation repeats. Some carbon arrangements begin to influence their surroundings more noticeably. They bind minerals. They alter local chemistry. They change how water behaves at surfaces. These changes make similar arrangements slightly more likely nearby, not guaranteed, slightly favoured, slightly is enough. Over millions of years, slight preferences compound, not into inevitability, but into narrowing. Chemistry's vast space of possibilities does not shrink. The tension within it does. Certain paths are walked more often because they are easier to return to. The planet continues listening through feedback. It does not guide carbon. It merely maintains conditions where return is possible. Circulation, gradients, repetition. Carbon supplies the rest through its tolerance for rearrangement. Nothing here seeks selfhood. Nothing seeks persistence beyond the moment. Yet persistence appears as residue of compatibility. Carbon fits the world the planet has become. That fit allows it to remain without effort. The ash that was once light now rests briefly in forms that remember enough of themselves to return again. Memory here is not stored. It is enacted through repetition that refuses to disappear entirely. What is emerging is not structure with purpose. It is structure with patience. And patience, given enough time, begins to feel like direction, without ever becoming one. Direction never arrives. What arrives instead is weight, the kind that builds when repetition is allowed to continue without interruption. Carbon does not move toward anything. It settles into what remains available when everything else dissolves too quickly to matter. Across the oceans and through stone, carbon's arrangements linger just long enough to be counted by time, even if nothing counts them. Each return strengthens familiarity. Each familiarity narrows what chemistry is willing to forget. Forgetting becomes selective. This selectivity is quiet. The planet does not announce that carbon has become important. It simply notices that reactions involving carbon repeat more often than others, not because they are better, but really use as a real better, because they tolerate variation without losing coherence. They bend, dissolve partially, return altered but recognizable. Recognition is not awareness, it is compatibility made visible through persistence. The oceans continue moving, carrying carbon endlessly through gradients that test it without exhausting it. The atmosphere continues exchanging, ensuring carbon is never isolated long enough to specialize into fragility. Stone continues pressing and releasing, teaching carbon how to hold shape under pressure, and then let go again. Fire's memory remains folded into these cycles, energy arriving gently, never overwhelming. Carbon learns how to carry energy forward without burning it away entirely. This ability changes what chemistry can attempt next. Some arrangements begin to last across environments, not just moments. They survive transport, they survive dilution, they survive burial and return. Survival here is not triumph, it it is permission to appear again. Appearing again is enough. The planet listens through its systems and finds nothing to correct. Balance holds. Gradients persist. Circulation continues. Carbon's patience fits the tempo of a world that has learned endurance rather than stability. Nothing has begun, but something has narrowed. The vast field of chemical possibility remains open, yet attention within it now leans, slightly, persistently, towards arrangements that can remain unfinished without vanishing. Carbon has taught chemistry how to hesitate, how to return, how to exist in pieces without losing continuity. The ash that was once light now waits in forms that remember themselves only through repetition. Memory has become structural. Persistence has become influence. What follows will not arrive as carbon's achievement. It will arrive as chemistry learning, quietly, that some arrangements do not dissolve as easily as others. And that reluctance, gentle, uncelebrated, is enough to change what becomes possible next. Some patterns are not chosen. They are simply the ones that stay. Memory does not arrive as awareness. It arrives as resistance, the slight delay before something disappears, the faint echo of a form that has already been. Chemistry does not know it is remembering. It only begins to hesitate. Across oceans and stone, arrangements that once dissolved immediately now linger just long enough to encounter themselves again. Not identical, never identical, but close enough that repetition begins to feel like return. This feeling belongs to time, not to matter. Reactions no longer reset completely. Water still moves. Heat still rises. Light still arrives and leaves. Yet within these motions, certain pathways recur. Molecules form, separate, and then, under similar conditions, form again. The second formation costs less energy than the first. Familiarity smooths effort. This smoothing matters. In sheltered pockets, within mineral pores, along layered clays, inside sedimented films, chemistry experiences reduced interruption. Motion slows. Concentration increases. Arrangements persist long enough to influence what happens next. Influence is not control. It is suggestion repeated. Some molecular groupings begin to shape their surroundings subtly. They bind surfaces. They alter local acidity. They change how water behaves at edges. These changes make similar reactions slightly more likely nearby. Not guaranteed, slightly favored. Favor accumulates. The planet does not direct this accumulation. It simply maintains circulation, gradients, and time. Memory grows because erasure is no longer complete. The world has learned how to keep traces. These traces do not point forward. They loop. A reaction leaves behind conditions that invite its return. Return reinforces those conditions. The loop is not closed. It is fragile, breakable, but it exists long enough to matter. This is not life rehearsing. It is chemistry discovering persistence. In shallow waters, cycles of drying and return concentrate compounds repeatedly. Each cycle compresses variety, forcing encounter. Some arrangements break under this pressure, others flex and remain. Flexibility becomes influence again. At depth, pressure stabilizes structures that would dissolve near the surface. These structures drift upward, altered but intact enough to persist briefly under new conditions. Transport spreads memory. The oceans carry these faint memories across distance. What forms in one place can return in another, tested under slightly different rules. Failure does not erase the path entirely. The path remains easier to walk again. Ease becomes direction without intention. Light participates quietly. Photons alter bonds just enough to create variation without destruction. Some variations re-enter familiar cycles and persist. Others vanish immediately. Selection is not harsh here. It is gentle, cumulative. Gentleness allows learning without awareness. The atmosphere continues exchanging gases, buffering extremes, ensuring no environment becomes too narrow. Narrow environments breed fragility. Broad ones favor tolerance. Tolerance persists. The planet listens through feedback loops that now include chemistry itself. Reactions influence environments. Environments influence reactions. The boundary between process and context softens. Memory becomes distributed. Nothing here thinks. Nothing plans. Yet the system begins to behave as though it recognizes itself. Not consciously, but structurally. Patterns reinforce their own return. Conditions remember outcomes. Time deepens again. Millions of years pass as these loops repeat, break, reform. Some vanish entirely, others persist longer than expected. Persistence invites repetition. Repetition invites refinement. Refinement narrows without deciding. The ash that was once light now moves through chemistry that no longer forgets completely. It remembers by doing again. It remembers by leaving traces that alter what happens next. This remembering is not stored anywhere, it is enacted. And enacted memory, once allowed to persist, changes the character of what chemistry is capable of becoming. What follows will not announce itself as emergent. It will arrive as chemistry, becoming slightly less willing to start over. Reluctance appears before structure. Chemistry begins to pause at the edge of dissolution, not because it resists change, but because change has become familiar enough to soften its edges. Molecules no longer vanish completely when conditions shift. They fragment, bend, rearrange, and then, under the next repetition, find their way back into something recognizably related. This return is not exact. Exactness is brittle. Resemblance endures. Across mineral surfaces, thin films of water slow motion enough for memory to take hold. Concentrations rise and fall predictably. Reactions occur, fade, occur again. Each cycle smooths pathways, lowering the cost of reassembly. What once required rare alignment now happens more easily simply because it has happened before. History becomes lubricant. In these sheltered environments, some arrangements begin to persist across multiple cycles without fully dissolving. They are not stable in the sense of permanence. They are stable in the sense of forgiveness. They survive being wrong, being incomplete, being altered. Forgiveness matters more than precision. Sediments bury these arrangements temporarily, pressing them into darkness where motion slows and heat reshapes gently. Burial protects without preserving perfectly. Bonds shift under pressure. Shapes adjust. When uplift and erosion return these materials to circulation, they carry altered memory back into active chemistry. Memory now travels. The oceans spread these altered arrangements widely. Currents carry them through layers of temperature and pressure, testing them without erasing them entirely. Each test leaves residue, slight adjustments that increase tolerance for variation. Variation becomes less threatening. Chemistry grows quieter in response. Not simpler, steadier. Reactions proceed along familiar routes more often than unfamiliar ones. Familiarity does not eliminate novelty. It frames it. Light continues its soft participation. Day-like pulses of energy introduce small disruptions that create variation without collapse. Some variations fit existing loops, others dissolve. The loops remain open, flexible, never fully closed. At interfaces, where clay meets water, where mineral meets dissolved gas, feedback becomes more pronounced. Reactions alter surfaces. Altered surfaces invite similar reactions. This reciprocity strengthens without awareness. Chemistry begins to shape context as much as context shapes chemistry. Context remembers. The planet continues listening through its systems. Heat flow, circulation, atmospheric buffering, all remain steady enough to allow memory to persist. Extremes still occur. Disturbances still arrive, but erasure is no longer total. Partial survival changes everything. When something survives partially, it does not need to begin again from nothing. It resumes. Resumption costs less energy than creation. Energy saved allows complexity to linger slightly longer. Linger becomes leverage. Across millions of years, these advantages compound gently. Chemistry narrows its attention toward arrangements that can be resumed after interruption. Interruption becomes part of the process rather than its end. The ash that was once light now moves through a system that does not forget entirely. Memory has no location. It exists in circulation, in surfaces, in repeated gradients. It exists because the planet has learned how to keep change from being absolute. This is not intelligence. It is inheritance behaving with patience. What is being learned is not how to live. It is how not to vanish, and learning how not to vanish is the quiet prerequisite for everything that will one day learn how to remain. Remembering deepens not by adding detail, but by losing the need to begin again. Chemistry does not grow complex all at once. It grows familiar with itself. Pathways that once required rare alignment now unfold with less resistance, simply because the environment has been shaped by their passing before. In thin films of water stretched across stone, reactions recur like footsteps in soft ground. Each pass leaves a trace, subtle changes in surface charge, texture, orientation. These traces do not direct chemistry, they incline it. Inclination, repeated often enough, becomes tendency. Tendency is quieter than rule. Mineral surfaces evolve through use. Clays exchange ions, altering how they bind molecules. Ion-bearing minerals shift oxidation states, changing how electrons move across boundaries. These changes invite certain reactions back while discouraging others, not through exclusion, but through ease. Ease repeats. Within these environments, molecular assemblies begin to persist across transitions that once erased them. Drying no longer guarantees collapse. Dilution no longer guarantees disappearance. Pressure reshapes without destroying. Heat rearranges without consuming. These assemblies do not survive everything. They survive enough. Enough accumulates. Sediments continue to bury and release, pressing chemistry into darkness where motion slows and time thickens. In this slowed world, rearrangement replaces reaction. Bonds slide rather than snap. Structures adapt rather than vanish. When uplift returns these materials to light and water, they do not return unchanged, they return trained. Training leaves bias. The oceans distribute this bias widely. Currents carry altered chemistry across basins, through gradients, into unfamiliar contexts. Most of it fails there. Failure is expected, but some survives long enough to re-enter familiar loops elsewhere, reinforced by recognition that does not know its own name. Recognition is repetition that costs less than novelty. The atmosphere participates as well, exchanging gases that alter reaction pathways subtly but persistently. Carbon dioxide modulates acidity. Nitrogen buffers extremes. Trace gases come and go, each arrival a small perturbation that leaves faint memory behind. Perturbation, when repeated, becomes texture. Light continues to punctuate cycles, never overwhelming, never absent. Photons alter bonds gently, creating variants that either fit existing loops or dissolve. Dissolution no longer erases the loop. The loop persists because its environment persists. This persistence allows chemistry to behave as though it expects itself to return. Not with certainty. With tolerance, the planet listens through these developments without intervention. Its role is complete in this regard. It has learned how to keep conditions from resetting entirely. It has learned how to let memory remain distributed rather than localized. Nothing more is required. Over long spans, chemistry grows less willing to start from zero. Even when disrupted, fragments carry enough coherence to reassemble along familiar lines. Assembly becomes resumption. Resumption changes scale. What once flickered now lingers. What lingered briefly now lingers long enough to influence what follows. Influence remains slight, but time is generous with slight advantages. Generosity accumulates. The ash that was once light now moves through chemistry that carries itself forward without knowing it. Memory is no longer rare, it is background. It is the quiet condition under which reactions occur. This remembering does not seek continuation, it produces it. And produced continuation begins to narrow the distance between chemistry and something that can endure itself, without yet knowing that endurance has a shape. What comes next will not be a leap. It will be a soft closing of distance. Distance closes without moving. Chemistry does not cross a line. The line thins until it is no longer useful to name. What remains is continuity that no longer dissolves completely when disturbed. Assemblies now endure long enough to shape what surrounds them, not strongly, not deliberately, but persistently. A molecule alters its immediate environment, changing local chemistry, slowing water, binding surfaces, and those alterations make similar assemblies slightly more likely to appear nearby. The effect is small, Time is not, small effects repeat. In shallow basins and mineral pores, loops stabilize, not as closed circles, but as familiar routes that reactions follow because they have been followed before. These routes survive interruption. They resume when conditions return. Return costs less energy than beginning. Energy saved accumulates as possibility. Sediments continue their quiet authorship, burying chemistry long enough to soften it without erasing it. Pressure reshapes bonds. Heat rearranges structures gently. When these altered forms return to circulation, they carry resilience rather than novelty. Resilience persists. The oceans carry this persistence widely, distributing memory without centralizing it. No single place holds the record. The record exists in motion, in circulation patterns, in recurring gradients, in surfaces shaped by use. Light continues to arrive and depart, creating variation without annihilation. Darkness follows, allowing rearrangement without interruption. The alternation teaches chemistry how to tolerate both presence and absence without collapse. The atmosphere buffers extremes. The magnetic field deflects enough to matter. The planet maintains conditions where erasure is partial rather than complete. Partial erasure allows memory to remain. Memory is no longer rare. It is structural. Chemistry has learned how to perceive without forgetting itself entirely, not by intention, by repetition allowed to continue long enough to matter. What remains is not a blueprint, not a plan, not a purpose. It is a tendency toward arrangements that can be interrupted and resumed, toward structures that survive being unfinished, toward processes that do not demand permanence to endure. The ash that was once light now circulates through a world where chemistry has learned how to hesitate before disappearing. That hesitation changes everything that will follow. Even though nothing yet knows what will follow, no beginning has occurred, but something irreversible has. Some truths are not discovered. They are practiced until forgetting becomes difficult. And what chemistry now carries forward is not awareness, but the quiet ability to remain itself long enough to change. Questions do not begin as questions. They begin as imbalance, something held just long enough to resist vanishing. The universe never asked whether matter could remember itself. It allowed conditions to repeat until memory became difficult to erase. Stars did not intend this. They burned. They collapsed. They scattered. What followed was not design, but inheritance, given time to settle. Now, in the quiet aftermath of chemistry learning how to resume, the planet carries patterns that no longer require instruction. They return because returning has become easier than dissolving. This ease does not announce itself. It hides in small efficiencies. Bonds that reassemble without effort. Reactions that follow familiar routes. Environments shaped by their own history. Nothing thinks. Nothing wonders. Yet something behaves as though the past matters. The stars remain distant. Their light steady. Their gravity patient. They do not intervene. Their role is complete. What they released has found its own tempo, slower and more careful than stellar fire ever was. On the planet's surface, cycles continue without pause. Water rises and falls, heat circulates, stone breaks and reforms. Within these motions, chemistry repeats itself with increasing confidence. Not certainty, confidence earned through endurance. Assemblies linger long enough to influence what comes next. Influence narrows possibility without closing it. The field remains vast. Attention within it leans. This leaning is the quietest form of direction. No mind asks what comes after chemistry that remembers. No force demands an answer. The universe does not care whether something follows. It only allows continuation to continue. Time deepens again. Millions of years pass as these tendencies refine themselves. Memory distributes itself further, embedding into motion, into surfaces, into cycles that no longer reset entirely. Erasure becomes incomplete by default. Incomplete erasure changes everything. What cannot be fully erased does not need to begin again. It resumes. Resumption costs less than creation. Cost matters. Low-cost pathways are walked more often. Repetition makes them familiar. Familiarity makes them persistent. The planet listens through this without interpretation. It does not name what is happening. It does not anticipate outcomes. It simply maintains conditions where interruption is softened, where return is possible. The stars never asked whether life could emerge from their ash. They did not need to. They asked nothing at all. And in asking nothing, they allowed a world to practice remembering until remembering became unavoidable. What follows will not arrive as answer. It will arrive as continuation that refuses to dissolve. Refusal to dissolve does not look like arrival. It looks like persistence that no longer apologizes for itself. Chemistry continues its cycles, but the tone has changed. What once flickered now lingers. What once vanished now leaves residue that alters what follows. This alteration is subtle. In warm shallows and mineral-lined depths, familiar arrangements return with less effort than before. They do not assemble faster because they are better. They assemble because the world around them has been shaped by their previous presence. Surfaces remember. Water remembers. Gradients remember. Memory has become environmental. The oceans carry this memory without owning it. Currents transport altered chemistry across distances so large they erase origin. What matters is not where something formed, but that it can form again elsewhere under similar conditions. Portability becomes influence. Turning to Ken, some arrangements begin to enclose themselves loosely, not as boundaries with intent, but as responses to water's pressure and chemistry's patience. Films gather, layers form, inside and outside begin to differ, not because difference is sought, but because motion makes it inevitable. These differences persist just long enough to matter. Light touches these arrangements briefly, altering them without erasing them. Darkness follows, allowing rearrangement without interruption. Daylight pulses continue their quiet punctuation. Variation enters gently. Most variations dissolve. A few return altered but intact enough to resume. The atmosphere participates, exchanging gases that feed reactions, and then withdraw. Nothing is stable. Stability is not required. Only continuity through change. The planet remains what it has learned to be, a keeper of partial erasure. Disturbances still arrive, impacts still occur, heat still surges, but none of these erase everything anymore. Something always remains to begin again from somewhere other than zero. This is the quiet turning, not toward purpose, toward endurance. Time stretches. Millions of years pass as chemistry grows more confident in its own return. Pathways deepen, alternatives remain possible, but they are walked less often because returning to familiarity costs less. The universe does not notice this shift. There is no signal bright enough to register at stellar distances. Nothing announces itself. Nothing celebrates. Yet the ash that once scattered freely now circulates through patterns that remember themselves across interruption. Memory is no longer rare. It is background. The stars never asked what this would become. They burned without concern for aftermath. They collapsed without foresight. They scattered elements without expectation. What followed is not their answer. It is their echo, softened by oceans, moderated by stone, carried by carbon, repeated by chemistry, until forgetting became inefficient. This echo continues, not loudly, patiently, and patience, practiced long enough, reshapes what is possible without ever needing to ask why. Inefficiency becomes guidance, not by instruction, but by exhaustion. Chemistry no longer explores all possibilities equally, not because choices appeared, but because some paths had been walked so often that leaving them requires more energy than staying. Familiarity does not forbid novelty. It simply makes return easier than departure. In warm waters and quiet sediments, arrangements resume themselves without ceremony. Fragments meet and recognize compatibility through fit, not memory. Recognition here is physical. Shapes aligning, charges balancing, movements slowing just enough to remain together. Nothing pauses to wonder why this works. It works because it has worked before. The planet continues its steady offering of conditions. Heat rises gently, water circulates endlessly, light arrives and withdraws. Pressure presses and releases. These rhythms do not change to accommodate chemistry. Chemistry adapts by matching their pace. Matching pace becomes survival. Some arrangements begin to shape their immediate surroundings more noticeably. A film alters how water flows across a surface. A clustered structure slows diffusion. A boundary creates difference between what is inside and what is outside. These differences are not defended. They are temporary, but they return often enough to matter. Inside and outside become useful distinctions. Not permanent, not secure, but repeatable. Repeatability invites continuation. Continuation invites refinement. Refinement narrows variation gently, without erasing it. The system becomes legible to itself, not through awareness, but through reduced surprise. Fewer outcomes are entirely new. More are variations on what has already occurred. Variation still matters. Light continues to rearrange bonds subtly. Heat still introduces change. Pressure still reshapes structures. Disturbance remains constant. What has changed is not the presence of disruption, but the system's response to it. Disruption no longer resets everything. It edits. Editing preserves context. The oceans carry these edited arrangements across vast distances, exposing them to new tests without dissolving them entirely. Some fail quickly, some persist just long enough to be edited again. Editing, layered upon editing, produces coherence without plan. Sediments continue their quiet role, burying chemistry long enough to soften extremes, then releasing it back into circulation, altered but intact. Burial becomes incubation without intention. The atmosphere continues to exchange gases, feeding reactions and withdrawing without favour. Carbon moves freely between sky and sea, threading continuity through all environments. Nitrogen buffers change. Oxygen remains reactive, waiting for conditions that will later matter more than they do now. The planet listens to none of this consciously. It simply continues being what it has learned to be, a place where interruption is partial, where memory can remain distributed, where resumption costs less than beginning. The stars remain unchanged overhead. They burn, they age, they collapse elsewhere. Their role in this story has ended, though their influence remains embedded in every bond and ratio. They do not ask what their ash has become. The question has moved inward, not into thought, but into structure. What is being asked now is not whether chemistry can remember, but how long remembering can persist without becoming something else. The system approaches this edge without crossing it. Hesitation deepens. Assemblies linger longer than before. Boundaries persist across more cycles. Return becomes reliable. Reliability feels like promise, though no promise is made. Time stretches again, folding millions of years into quiet continuation. The distance between chemistry and endurance narrows further, not by leap, but by erosion of forgetting. Some changes do not arrive as events. They arrive as habits that stop breaking. And habits, once established, reshape the future without announcing themselves. The ash that was once light now circulates through a world where chemistry no longer vanishes easily. It pauses, it resumes. It edits itself through return. What comes next will not answer the question the stars never asked. It will make the question unnecessary. Necessity fades when continuation becomes easier than disappearance. Chemistry does not cross into something new. It settles into something that no longer falls apart completely. The difference is quiet, but it is permanent. Arrangements now persist through cycles that once erased them. Drying no longer means loss. Dilution no longer means forgetting. Pressure reshapes without destroying. Heat edits without consuming. These changes do not protect structures. They teach them how to endure disturbance without needing to remain unchanged. Endurance becomes ordinary. The oceans carry this ordinariness across the planet, distributing memory without owning it. What forms in one place is tested elsewhere, altered, returned. The system no longer depends on rare alignment. It depends on familiarity. Familiarity reduces cost. Reduced cost invites repetition. Repetition reshapes probability. The atmosphere continues to exchange, buffering extremes, refusing stagnation. The planet continues its slow circulation of heat and matter, maintaining gradients just long enough for memory to persist. Nothing is optimized. Everything is tolerated. Toleration proves powerful. Boundaries appear and dissolve. Inside and outside matter briefly, then matter again. These distinctions do not hold forever. They hold long enough to be useful. Usefulness here is measured only by return. The stars above remained silent. They never asked what their ash would become. They never needed to. The answer is not spoken. It is enacted through persistence that refuses to vanish, through chemistry that resumes rather than restarts. The opening question softens now, folding back into itself. What if ancient stars shaped Earth's chemistry before life began? They did not shape it with intention. They shaped it by leaving, by scattering matter that could endure pressure, tolerate change, and remember through repetition. By giving the planet ingredients that could fail slowly instead of breaking quickly. By allowing time to practice without interference. What followed was not destiny. It was patience, meeting patience. The planet did not awaken. Chemistry did not decide. Memory did not arrive suddenly. Forgetting simply became inefficient. And in that inefficiency, everything that would one day matter found room to remain unfinished long enough to change. The ash that was once light still moves, through stone, through water, through air, carrying no message, no purpose, no question, only continuity. Some answers are not given. They are lived quietly by matter that learns how to stay. And the universe, having never asked, continues without waiting. The stars burn on, the planet turns, and what was once scattered remains. The stars never asked a question. The planet never offered an answer. Light burned, collapsed, scattered, and then time did the rest. What was once fire learned how not to break. What was once dust learned how to remain. What was once silence learned how to carry memory without thought, without intention. There is no beginning here. No announcement, no moment called life. Only a condition where forgetting is no longer the easiest path. The stars still burn, the planet still turns, and the chemistry that followed was never a response. Some truths are not spoken, they endure.